Sometimes the hardest stories to tell are the ones that truly happened. Because behind every case there is a real family, real pain, and real consequences. Good evening and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. If you're new here, welcome. On this channel we explore true crime stories for sleep in a calm and respectful way. Before we begin, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. In tonight's episode, we'll explore 5 solved true crime cases that once haunted investigators before justice was finally served. Stories once clouded by secrecy, fear, and betrayal, until careful investigation brought the truth to light. Each case unfolds slowly and respectfully, accompanied by our familiar rain sounds and black screen for peaceful listening. As always, these stories involve real people and real tragedies. They are shared not for entertainment, but to honor the victims and raise awareness. For the best experience, lower the volume slightly, get comfortable, and let the rain gently carry you into rest. Alright, dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin tonight's first story. Story 1. The Murder of Hannah Leflar. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the winter of 2015. In the quiet city of Regina, Saskatchewan. It's a story about a young girl named Hannah, a story about trust betrayed, and about the darkness that can sometimes hide behind familiar faces. Let the story wash over you as we journey through the events that led to one devastating January afternoon. Take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. Hannah Maggie Leflar came into this world on a Thursday, November 19th, 1998. Her father, Jeff, was the first person to kiss her sweet face. From the very beginning, Hannah was described as a happy little girl. Though naturally shy at first, she had this remarkable quality. She warmed up quickly to people, and everyone she met felt touched by her presence. She grew up in Regina, Saskatchewan, a city of approximately 200,000 people, where winters are long and cold, and communities are tight-knit. Hannah was fortunate to have 4 loving parents helping to raise her. Her mother, Janet, her stepfather, Wade Anderson, her father, Jeff, and her stepmother, Loredana. She had stepbrothers too, Dylan, Mitchell, and Alexandru. It was a blended family, but a loving one. As Hannah grew from that happy little girl into her teenage years, she blossomed. She was becoming bright, beautiful, and confident. She attended Tom Collegiate in Regina, where she was a grade 11 student on the honor roll. Hannah worked hard at her studies. She had friends. She had a life filled with the normal rhythms of teenage existence. School days, social media, friendships, and yes, eventually romance. In the fall of 2014, as autumn leaves turned golden and fell from the trees in Regina, Hannah was 16 years old. She had recently celebrated her sweet 16th birthday, surrounded by friends who loved her. In photographs from that party you can see her smile, genuine, warm, the smile of someone who had no idea how little time she had left. Around this same time, Hannah had been in a relationship with a boy. For privacy reasons, because he was 16 when these events began. We'll call him by the name the courts eventually released. Skylar Prochner. Skylar was also 16. A classmate, someone who would become part of Hannah's world. But here's something you need to understand about Skylar Prochner. He was not like other teenagers. Behind his everyday exterior, there was something deeply troubled. Court-appointed mental health professionals would later describe him as a deeply disturbed young man. Some would go even further, saying he displayed psychopathic tendencies, a rarity among the thousands of young people they had evaluated over their careers. Skylar had a difficult childhood. He experienced physical and emotional abuse from his mother. He was bullied at school. He witnessed constant fighting between his parents. By the age of 9, he was diagnosed with mild depression. As he grew older, he began telling people he heard voices in his head. Voices that, according to his later testimony, only stopped after Hannah's death. But in the fall of 2014, Hannah didn't know the full extent of what was happening inside Skylar's mind. They dated for a time like teenagers do, and then, as often happens in teenage relationships, Hannah ended it. She wanted to move on. She had every right to move on. Skylar Prochner, however, could not accept this. After Hannah broke up with him, something dark took root in Skylar's mind. He couldn't let her go. He couldn't accept that she might be happy with someone else. And when he learned that Hannah had started dating a new boy, that darkness grew into something more dangerous, obsession mixed with rage. In the confines of his bedroom, Skylar began fantasizing. Not just idle daydreams, but detailed, elaborate fantasies about hurting people. Specifically, he fantasized about hurting, possibly even killing Hannah's new boyfriend. And he began to make plans. He called it Project Zombify. It sounds almost absurd, doesn't it? Like something out of a teenager's violent video game fantasy. Baseball bats, including one that he drove nails through, creating a medieval-looking weapon. He collected samurai swords, pellet guns, a hacksaw, even a bow and arrow. His room became an arsenal. He recruited several friends to help with his plan. He gathered masks to conceal identities, duct tape to cover shoe prints. He even tried to buy chloroform, wanting to knock Hannah out if she got in the way. But when he couldn't get it, he settled for paint thinner instead. According to Skylar's own testimony, Hannah wasn't supposed to be the target. She would merely be collateral damage if she interfered with the attack on her new boyfriend. Think about that phrase, collateral damage. It's the language of war, of military operations, applied to a 16-year-old girl by her ex-boyfriend. The plan was elaborate, detailed, thought out. And then something happened that should have ended it. Hannah broke up with her new boyfriend. Project Zombify lost its target. The plan was called off. For a brief moment, tragedy might have been averted. But Skylar's obsession with Hannah didn't end. After the breakup, Skylar tried again to win Hannah back. He approached her, attempted to convince her to renew their relationship. But Hannah, exercising the agency and independence that any 16-year-old girl should have, told him clearly to leave her alone. She wanted to move on with her life. So Skylar created a fake Facebook account. In the shadows of social media, where anyone can be anyone, he began stalking her online, watching her posts, seeing who she talked to, monitoring her life from behind a digital mask. And then Hannah started dating someone new, another boy. When Skylar learned about this, the rage that had been simmering inside him reignited with even greater intensity. This time, though, he didn't want to hurt Hannah's boyfriend. This time, his focus had shifted. This time, Hannah herself became the target. In September of 2014, while Skylar was briefly in a psychiatric unit for his mental health issues, he had a conversation with a female friend on Facebook. The messages were later recovered and presented in court. In them, Skylar wrote chilling words. "I kinda really want to kill Hannah. Like, it literally crosses my mind pretty much every day. I pretty much have it all planned out, and I don't think she's safe around me. If I saw her with another guy, I'd probably kill them both." 3 months before Hannah's death, Skylar wrote something even more disturbing. "I think I might become a serial killer." The friend who received these messages was horrified, but she didn't know what to do. And here's one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this entire story. Dozens of teenagers knew that Hannah was in danger. Dozens. They knew Skylar was making threats. They knew he was unstable. But nobody told the adults who could have intervened. Nobody called the police. Nobody warned Hannah's parents. In the world of teenagers, where loyalty to friends often trumps everything else, where nobody wants to be labeled a snitch, where the consequences of violence seem abstract and far away, nobody spoke up. For his new plan, Skylar recruited someone he thought he could trust, his lifelong friend. This second teenager, who cannot be named because he was 16 at the time and received a youth sentence, would play a crucial role in what was about to happen. Skylar gave this friend specific instructions. He asked him to bring a knife to school, and crucially, he asked him to convince Hannah to come to her house after school, where she would be alone. The friend was supposed to make up some reason, some excuse that would get Hannah to agree to hang out with him at her home. Hannah's friends later said that she found the invitation sketchy. She told her own boyfriend, "I don't trust him." Some deep instinct within her sensed that something was wrong. But she was 16 years old, and this was someone she considered a friend, someone she had known. Despite her misgivings, she agreed. It was the last decision Hannah would ever make. January 12th, 2015 was a Monday. A school day like any other in the depths of a Saskatchewan winter. The temperature in Regina that day would have been well below freezing. The kind of cold that makes your breath fog in the air and your fingers ache if you're outside without gloves for too long. Hannah went to Tom Collegiate that day. Like always, she attended her classes. She was doing well academically. An honor roll student with a bright future ahead of her. If you had seen her in the hallways that day, you would have seen a normal teenage girl, carrying books, talking with friends, living her life. But that afternoon, after school ended, 2 boys waited near Hannah's house on Garnet Street North. Skylar Prochner wore latex work gloves, the kind you'd wear if you didn't want to leave fingerprints. He wore dark jeans and a camouflage jacket, and he carried with him a hunting knife. His friend, the accomplice, had already done his job. He had convinced Hannah to meet him at her house. She had agreed, despite her misgivings, despite telling people it felt sketchy, and now she was heading home. The two boys staked out the house, waiting, watching. Hannah's stepfather, Wade Anderson, was at work. Her mother, Janet, was at work. The house at 400 Garnet Street North was empty. It should have been a safe place home, the one place where you're supposed to be protected from the world's dangers. Hannah arrived. The accomplice went with her into the house, and then Skylar followed. What happened next unfolded in Hannah's stepfather's bedroom. The accomplice would later testify, though his testimony shifted multiple times, and prosecutors said he was evasive and dishonest, that he was halfway to the kitchen when he heard Hannah scream. "What the F?" she yelled. And then there was just screaming after that. He said he walked to the doorway and froze. At first he thought Skylar was hitting Hannah. He didn't see the knife immediately, but then Skylar stood up and the accomplice saw it, the hunting knife, now slick with blood. Hannah's screaming stopped. She was trying to breathe. The accomplice heard a dull thud, and then Hannah's breathing stopped too. The accomplice would later claim he wanted to help her. He said he was frozen, couldn't move, was in shock. Prosecutors questioned this version of events extensively. Under cross-examination, the accomplice admitted that he had actually wished death upon Hannah. He admitted to lying on the stand multiple times. He had told so many different versions of what happened that he had started to believe his own lies. But whatever the truth of what the accomplice did or didn't do, one fact remained undisputed. Skylar Prochner stabbed Hannah Leflar at least 10 times with that hunting knife. It was a brutal, sustained attack. She died there, on the floor of her stepfather's bedroom, at approximately 3:45 in the afternoon. After it was done, Skylar gave the bloody knife and Hannah's phone to his accomplice to store. He had cut his own left hand during the attack. Then, with Hannah lying dead behind them, the two teenagers left the house. At the accomplice's request, or so he claimed, a text message was sent to one of their friends. "Project Zombify is complete." Skylar Prochner went to a female friend's house. His hand was bleeding from where he'd cut it. When the friend and her mother saw the injury and asked what happened, Skylar told them he'd hurt his hand in a hunting accident. The friend's mother, wanting to help, drove him to Regina General Hospital for treatment. At the hospital, medical staff treated his wounded hand. They had no idea that the injury had come from murdering a teenage girl just a short time earlier. Skylar received care and was sent on his way. Meanwhile, Wade Anderson, Hannah's stepfather, was finishing up his workday. He came home at the usual time, probably thinking about what to make for dinner, what the evening would hold. All the mundane thoughts that fill our minds as we return home. He walked into his house on Garnet Street North, and there, on the floor of his bedroom, he found Hannah. Face down, dead. Emergency services received the call at 5:43 in the evening. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but there was nothing they could do. Hannah had been dead for hours. She was 16 years old. Her life, which should have stretched out ahead of her for decades, filled with graduations and first jobs and falling in love and traveling the world and all the 1,000 experiences she would never have ended in her stepfather's bedroom on a January afternoon. Wade Anderson's life changed forever in that moment. Janet Leflar's life changed forever. Jeff Leflar's life changed forever. Everyone who loved Hannah had their worlds shattered. Later that night, Skylar confessed to his brother. He explained that he had done something very bad. He said he had stabbed Hannah with a knife. And in a detail that still haunts those who heard it in court, Skylar imitated the sounds Hannah made as she was dying. The hunting knife was buried near an abandoned farmyard. Skylar's bloody jeans and Hannah's broken phone were hidden. But within 24 hours, police had enough evidence to make arrests. On January 13th, 2015, Skylar Prochner and his accomplice were both taken into custody. They were charged with first-degree murder. One week after Hannah's death, on January 19th, 2015, the Regina community held a candlelight vigil. It began at exactly 5:43 in the evening, the same time emergency workers had been called to Hannah's home 7 days earlier. Over 100 people gathered at Tom Collegiate. Many of them were students who had known Hannah. Some were parents, unable to imagine the horror of burying their own child. They lit candles against the January darkness. They walked from the school to Garnet Street, to the house where Hannah had died. Many shed tears as they set candles down outside the Leflar home. One of the organizers, a woman named Candace Nagy, explained why she felt compelled to do something. My son was friends with her, and I need to do something for healing for the kid. Healing for the parents. I can't imagine having to bury my child. Hannah's obituary, published in the Regina Leader Post, described her as having been a happy little girl who touched everyone she met throughout her short life. It said she was growing into a bright, beautiful, confident young woman when her life was taken suddenly and tragically. Her family, her mother Janet, her stepfather Wade, her father Jeff, her stepmother Loredana, her stepbrothers, all faced a grief that defied description. Janet Leflar would later say they were living in hell, trying to find some semblance of normalcy but unable to do so. The home where Hannah died remained their home, and Janet lived with constant anxiety about being in the place where her daughter was murdered. Because both Skylar Prochner and his accomplice were 16 years old at the time of the murder, they initially could not be named under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act. They were tried in youth court, but the Crown prosecutors argued for adult sentences, which would mean harsher penalties and, crucially for Hannah's family, would allow their names to be made public. In April of 2016, over a year after Hannah's death, Skylar Prochner pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. His accomplice was originally also charged with first-degree murder, but eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The sentencing hearings revealed disturbing details that the public hadn't known before. Evidence was presented about the weapons found in Skylar's room, the arsenal he had been collecting. Facebook messages were made public, showing his threats against Hannah and his musings about becoming a serial killer. Psychiatric evaluations were discussed in open court. Dr. Brent Harold, who works with psychiatric diseases at the Paul DeJack Youth Center where Skylar was held, had 17 sessions with the teenager over the course of 2 years. Out of more than 5,000 young people Dr. Harold had seen in his 19 years of practice, Skylar Prochner was among only 4 or 5 who displayed psychopathic tendencies. The doctor testified that Skylar showed a lack of empathy and remorse, demonstrated callousness, and needed significant treatment. Without it, Harold said, Skylar was likely to re-offend. Another psychiatrist, Dr. Oladapo Soyemi, wrote in his report that Skylar had experienced numerous childhood adversities, including physical and emotional abuse from his mother, bullying at school, and witnessing constant parental conflict. But none of these factors excused what he had done. The judge who would ultimately sentence him, Justice Jennifer Pritchard, noted that these issues might explain some things about Skylar's psychology, but she wrote, "It does not rev them up to commit this type of cruel, persistent, bloody, and hands-on first-degree murder." On July 5, 2017, 2.5 years after Hannah's murder, Justice Jennifer Pritchard announced her sentencing decision for Skylar Prochner. She had decided to sentence him as an adult. Skylar Prochner, now 19 years old, was sentenced to life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 10 years. Under Canadian law for first-degree murder, this was the mandatory sentence once the adult designation was made. As the sentencing was read, Skylar was reportedly expressionless, looking up and listening to the judge but showing no visible emotion. When the decision was announced, something unusual happened in the courtroom. People applauded. Crown Prosecutor Chris White later said it was the first time in his career he had heard applause in a courtroom, but he understood it as the family's expression of relief. Hannah's mother, Janet Leflar, spoke to reporters afterward. "We're relieved that he got the adult sentence," she said. "We can finally say Skylar Prochner murdered my daughter, but there are no winners today." And then she added something that revealed her determination. "I'll be back to fight for that too," referring to Skylar's eventual parole hearing. Still a decade away. The family had been pushing hard for the adult sentence for a specific reason. They wanted Skylar Prochner's name to be public. "I want his name Googled," Janet had said before the sentencing. She wanted the world to know who killed her daughter. In her 45-page sentencing decision, Justice Pritchard called Skylar the sole architect of Hannah's murder. She said he was fueled by jealousy and anger. She noted the brutality of the attack, describing it as cruel, persistent, bloody, and hands-on. She considered the way he killed Hannah and his perseverance in carrying out the attack, calling it a brutal and sustained attack. Skylar Prochner was sent to a federal penitentiary to serve his sentence. He had been in custody at the Paul DeJack Youth Center since his arrest on January 13, 2015, more than 900 days, but now he would be transferred to an adult facility. The case of Skylar's accomplice was more complicated. Prosecutors argued that he should also receive an adult sentence, despite his claims that he had frozen during the attack and hadn't physically participated in the stabbing. The Crown Prosecutor Chris White made a powerful argument. He pointed out that the accomplice had lured Hannah to her house, knowing what Skylar intended to do. "You set her up to be alone. You ushered her to her death, Janet Leflar said in court, staring at the accomplice. White called the accomplice's lack of motive terrifying. Unlike Skylar, who was driven by jealousy and obsession, the accomplice had no romantic or personal reason to want Hannah dead. He simply went along with it. I wish death on Hannah Leflar, the accomplice eventually admitted in a dramatic courtroom outburst. After hours of questioning, revealed inconsistencies in his testimony. The sentencing hearing for the accomplice lasted more than a week in September of 2017. He testified on his own behalf, changing his story multiple times. First, he claimed he had frozen and wanted to help Hannah. Under cross-examination by prosecutor Chris White, who called him evasive, self-serving, and testy, the accomplice's testimony fell apart. He eventually admitted to lying extensively about his level of involvement, about his feelings toward Hannah, about nearly everything. Court psychologists painted a picture of a teenager from a troubled background. He'd had a rocky childhood, experiencing abuse from caregivers. In elementary school, he'd been a loner who had temper tantrums and was bullied. He struggled to make and keep friends, but he'd also held a steady job at a fast food restaurant and used his earnings to help provide for his family. Justice Leon Schwann, who presided over the accomplice's sentencing, noted that he had lived the life of an average 16-year-old, be it playing video games, having a girlfriend, and going to school. But she also wrote, "The truly unfortunate part is that Skylar Prochner, his closest friend, was dangerously dark and unstable." On November 7, 2017, Justice Schwann announced her decision. Despite the Crown's arguments, she concluded that the prosecution had not proven the accomplice had enough moral blameworthiness or culpability to warrant an adult sentence. The accomplice, now 19 years old, received a youth sentence, 7 years through Saskatchewan's intensive rehabilitative custody supervision program, with 4 years to be served in custody and 3 years in the community. Because of the youth designation, his name would remain protected by law. The public would never know his identity. Hannah's family was devastated. They sobbed in the courtroom. Janet Leflar later said the family was upset and didn't see this as closure. They had hoped the accomplice would receive an adult sentence like Skylar had. Even the accomplice's own brother was outraged. As he left the courtroom, he shouted, "You deserved an adult sentence." Justice Schwann's 62-page decision acknowledged that it was not an easy one to make. She wrote that she was very mindful of the extreme violence perpetrated on an innocent young girl within the sanctuary of her own home, for no apparent reason other than to avenge a jilted boyfriend's hurt feelings. But she felt that the accomplice's reduced level of planning, the fact that he was not the key perpetrator, his age, his lack of a prior criminal record, and his immaturity and vulnerability all weighed in favor of a youth sentence. She concluded that the accomplice presented a low risk to reoffend, provided he received proper treatment for his undiagnosed disorders, in addition to his depression. The IRCS program, she felt, was his best shot at rehabilitation. The accomplice was given no credit for time already served. He would spend 4 years in custody at a youth facility, though he would have to transfer to an adult facility when he turned 20. In October of 2018, the accomplice had his mandatory yearly sentencing review. Court heard that he had made some progress and appeared remorseful, but Justice Jeff Kalmakoff noted there was still a long way to go. The young man was struggling with emotional regulation, motivation, and conflict with others. He had threatened self-harm. His sentence remained unchanged. A major concern was the lack of family support. The accomplice's parents did not attend the review hearing. Justice Kalmakoff noted that their absence was a major factor in the feasibility of a successful release into the community. Meanwhile, Skylar Prochner remained in federal prison, serving his life sentence. Under Canadian law, he would not be eligible to apply for parole until January 13, 2025, 10 years after his arrest. Even then, parole is not guaranteed. It's merely the point at which he can apply. Janet Leflar has made clear that when that time comes, she will be there to oppose his release. "I'll be back to fight for that too," she promised. Looking back on Hannah Leflar's murder, so many questions linger in the air like smoke that won't dissipate. How did a 16-year-old boy amass an arsenal of weapons in his bedroom without adults noticing? Skylar had knives, samurai swords, pellet guns, a hacksaw, a bow and arrow, and a baseball bat with nails hammered into it. Where were the parents? Where were the other adults in his life? How did dozens of teenagers know that Hannah was in danger? Yet not one of them told an adult who could have intervened. Friends later testified that they knew Skylar was making threats. They knew he was unstable. They knew Hannah wasn't safe. But the code of teenage loyalty, the fear of being labeled a snitch, The inability to grasp that this threat was real kept them all silent. What if just one person had spoken up? What if someone had shown those Facebook messages to a parent, a teacher, a school counselor, a police officer? Would Hannah Leflar still be alive? And what about Hannah herself, who felt that the invitation was sketchy, who told people I don't trust him? She had good instincts. Something inside her knew. But she was 16 years old and he was a friend, and surely nothing that bad could happen. How many times do we all ignore our own instincts because we don't want to seem rude or paranoid? The psychology professor at the University of Regina, Dr. Bridget Kless, spoke about the unique trauma of losing a loved one to violence. The loss itself is always going to be horrifying, she said. When death comes suddenly and violently, when it happens to someone young in a place that should have been safe, the grief becomes more complicated, more difficult to process. Janet Leflar said she severed some relationships because of her grief. She hasn't been able to work since the day Hannah was killed. She lives with anxiety about being in the home where her daughter was murdered. Wade Anderson will forever carry the memory of finding Hannah's body. Jeff Leflar lost his only child. You can't go forward, you can't go back, you're in limbo, Jeff said. We've been given a life sentence. So what do we take from this story? What lessons can be drawn from such senseless tragedy? Hannah Leflar was by all accounts a lovely young person, bright, beautiful, confident, an honor roll student, someone who touched everyone she met. She had her whole life ahead of her, and it was stolen from her by someone who couldn't accept that she had the right to move on, to make her own choices, to live her own life. Her story is a reminder of how deadly obsession can be, of how rejection can fester in unstable minds and transform into rage, of how important it is to take threats seriously, even when they come from teenagers who might seem like they're just talking tough. It's a reminder that adults need to pay attention to the warning signs in young people's lives, that weapons in a teenager's bedroom are not normal, that violent fantasies are not normal, that threats against others, even made online or in private messages, are not normal and should never be dismissed as just talk. It's a reminder that when someone says they don't trust a situation, when their instincts are sending up red flags, those instincts should be honored and investigated. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that we have a responsibility to speak up when we know someone is in danger. The code of silence among Hannah's peers, the dozens of teenagers who knew and didn't tell, may not have been malicious, but it was deadly. Young people need to understand that telling an adult about a credible threat is not snitching. It's potentially saving a life. Hannah's parents have had to carry on without their daughter. They attend parole hearings for her killers. They cope with grief that, according to Dr. Klest, will likely never fully resolve. It will only change over time. They have been given, as Jeff Leflar said, a life sentence of their own. They also keep Hannah's memory alive. They speak her name. They share her story. Janet Leflar made sure that Skylar Prochner's name would be public, so that when people Google him, they will find the truth about what he did. She wants people to know that her daughter's life mattered, that Hannah was real, that this wasn't just another news story. It was the destruction of their family. As of the time this story is being told, Skylar Prochner remains incarcerated in a Canadian federal prison. His parole eligibility date has now passed. It was January 13th, 2025. Whether he has applied for parole or whether any parole hearing has taken place is not public information at this time. What is known is that Janet Leflar promised to be there to oppose any release. The accomplice, having received a youth sentence of 7 years with 4 years in custody, has likely completed the custodial portion of his sentence. He would be under community supervision for the remaining 3 years. His identity remains protected by law. He could be anyone, a person you pass on the street, someone who stood by and watched a teenage girl be murdered, and who will carry that knowledge with him for the rest of his life. Hannah Leflar is buried in Regina. She is remembered by her family and friends. She never got to graduate from Tom Collegiate, never got to go to university, never got to fall in love again, to travel, to pursue a career, to have children of her own, to grow old. All of those possibilities died with her on January 12th, 2015, in her stepfather's bedroom, at the hands of a boy who couldn't let her go. And so ends the story of Hannah Leflar, a tragedy that unfolded in the cold of a Saskatchewan winter, a reminder that evil can wear familiar faces, that danger can come from those we think we know, and that the decisions we make to speak up or stay silent, to pay attention or look away, can have profound consequences. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Hannah. Remember her smile at her 16th birthday party. Remember that she was a real person, loved and lost, whose life mattered. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Murder of Joshua Hilberling. Tonight we'll explore a case that captivated the nation, a story that unfolded high above the streets of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a story of young love, turbulent marriage, and a tragic fall that left more questions than answers. This is the case of Joshua Hilberling. This is a story that took place on a summer day in 2011, in an apartment tower that rose 25 stories above downtown Tulsa. It's a story about Joshua and Amber Hilberling, two young people whose whirlwind romance would end in tragedy, leaving behind a baby who would never know his father, and questions that still linger to this day. Joshua Blaine Hilberling was born on May 30th, 1988, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Those who knew him described Josh as kind-hearted and selfless, the type of person who would put others' needs before his own. He had that quiet strength that comes from genuine compassion. His parents, Patrick and Jean Hilberling, watched their son grow into a young man with promise and potential. As Josh moved through his early 20s, he made the decision to serve his country. He enlisted in the United States Air Force, following a path that many young men from Oklahoma had walked before him. The military would give him structure, purpose, and a future. He completed his basic training in Texas, where the days were long and hot, filled with drills and discipline that would prepare him for service. It was during this period, in early 2010, that Josh's life would change in ways he couldn't have predicted. He met a young woman named Amber Michelle Fields. Amber had been born on October 1st, 1991 in Joplin, Missouri. When she was just 3 months old, her family relocated to Tulsa, where she would spend her formative years. Amber came from what many would consider a privileged background. Her mother, Rhonda, was a nurse, and her stepfather, Brian Whitlock, was a successful plastic surgeon. The family was well known in Tulsa social circles, and Amber wanted for little growing up. In school, Amber excelled. She maintained a 4.0 grade point average, participated in soccer, volleyball, track, and dance. She was described as smart, athletic, and beautiful, someone who seemed to have the world at her feet. She loved fashion, makeup, and shoes. She was a talented writer. By all outward appearances, Amber Fields had a bright future ahead of her. When Josh and Amber met in early 2010, the attraction was immediate and intense. What began as a casual meeting quickly blossomed into a whirlwind romance. Friends would later describe them as being completely enamored with each other. Amber often spoke of Josh as the love of her life. For Josh, Amber represented something exciting, someone who brought energy and passion into his world. But there was a complication on the horizon. Josh had received his orders from the Air Force. He was being stationed at Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska, thousands of miles from Oklahoma, from family, from everything familiar. The assignment would take him far from Tulsa, and far from Amber. Military regulations were clear. Unmarried partners could not live together in on-base housing. If Josh and Amber wanted to stay together, if Amber wanted to follow Josh to Alaska, there was only one solution. They would have to get married. The decision came quickly. In August of 2010, just a few months after meeting, Josh and Amber applied for a marriage license in Wichita Falls, Texas. It was practical, hurried, driven by circumstance rather than long planning. In October of that same year, the newlyweds packed their belongings and moved to Alaska. At 22 years old, Josh was starting a new chapter in his military career. At 19, Amber was leaving behind her family, her friends, everything she'd ever known, to follow a man she'd known for less than a year to one of the most remote parts of the United States. Alaska would prove to be more challenging than either of them anticipated. The Alaskan wilderness can be beautiful and brutal in equal measure. For military families stationed at Eielson Air Force Base, located near Fairbanks, life meant adapting to extreme cold, long dark winters, and isolation from the world they'd known. For Josh and Amber, Alaska tested their young marriage immediately. Josh had his duties on the base, his training, his responsibilities. Amber found herself alone in their small military housing, far from any support system. She had no family to call, no friends to visit, no familiar places to escape to when the walls felt like they were closing in. The honeymoon period, that blissful time when new couples see only the best in each other, faded quickly. The strain of their situation began to show. They were essentially strangers who had legally bound themselves to each other, now forced to navigate the realities of married life in an unforgiving environment. Arguments began. Small disagreements grew into larger conflicts. The relationship that had seemed so passionate and exciting back in Oklahoma began to reveal underlying tensions. Both Josh and Amber struggled with the isolation, but they struggled differently, and those differences drove wedges between them. Then came the blow that would change everything again. Josh was dishonorably discharged from the Air Force. The exact reasons for his discharge would later become a matter of dispute. According to some accounts, there were drug-related issues. Amber would later tell television host Dr. Phil that Josh had been released partly because of these problems. There were also reports of incidents involving the couple, including one where Josh allegedly threw a plate at Amber and attempted to damage her breast implants. The military had apparently become aware of problems both with Josh's conduct and the volatile nature of his marriage. Whatever the specific reasons, the discharge meant their time in Alaska was over. Josh and Amber were headed back to Tulsa, back to family, back to a place where their problems would no longer be hidden in the isolation of an Alaskan military base. Their return to Oklahoma should have offered a fresh start. Instead, it brought new complications. With nowhere else to go, Josh and Amber moved in temporarily with Amber's mother and stepfather, Rhonda and Brian Whitlock. The arrangement was meant to be short-term, just until the young couple could get on their feet and find a place of their own. But cramming two troubled newlyweds into a home with in-laws created a pressure cooker situation. The arguments between Josh and Amber didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. Now they were happening under Rhonda and Brian's roof, and the Whitlocks had a front row seat to just how dysfunctional their daughter's marriage had become. The primary point of conflict, according to later testimony, centered around drug use. The Whitlocks accused Josh of using drugs. They demanded that he leave their home. Amber, despite the obvious problems in her marriage, made a choice. She could stay with her wealthy, supportive family, or she could leave with Josh. She chose Josh. This decision, made in the heat of emotion and conflict, would prove to be one of the most fateful of her young life. Rhonda Whitlock, despite her frustrations with Josh, still cared about her daughter's well-being. She owned a spare apartment at the University Club Tower on South Carson Street in downtown Tulsa. The building was a high-rise, one of Tulsa's taller structures, built back in 1966. Rhonda typically used the apartment for out-of-town guests, but now she offered it to Josh and Amber as a place to live while they sorted out their situation. The apartment was on the 17th floor. Later, this detail would become crucial, though at the time it seemed unremarkable. It was Unit 2509. The windows in the apartment, like all the windows in the aging building, were large and offered sweeping views of downtown Tulsa. On a clear day, you could see for miles. By the spring of 2011, Josh and Amber had settled into this high-rise apartment. But settling in didn't mean finding peace. The relationship continued to deteriorate, and then Amber discovered she was pregnant. The news of Amber's pregnancy brought a complex mix of emotions. For some couples, a baby represents hope, a chance to build something better, a reason to put aside differences and work together. For Josh and Amber, the pregnancy seemed to add another layer of stress to an already strained relationship. Josh, by multiple accounts, wanted to be a father. He looked forward to having a son, but he also recognized that the environment of his marriage was toxic. He confided in his father, Patrick, about his concerns. Amber was using drugs while pregnant, Josh told his father. Marijuana, specifically. Josh couldn't watch her harm their unborn child. He felt trapped between his desire to be a father and his inability to control what was happening around him. The violence in the relationship escalated. Both families would later testify that Josh and Amber were mutually abusive, that they hurt each other, that the relationship had become co-combative and dangerous. In May of 2011, just weeks before everything would fall apart, Josh took a significant step. After an incident where Amber threw a lamp at him, causing an injury that required stitches and staples, Josh filed for a protective order against his wife. Let that sink in for a moment. A husband filing for protection from his wife. In a society where domestic violence is often framed as something men do to women, Josh's protective order tells us that the violence in this relationship was more complicated than simple narratives allow. According to some accounts, when the sheriff arrived at Amber's mother's house to serve the protective order, both Josh and Amber laughed about it. They didn't take it seriously. Josh's father, Patrick, would later say that even then, he knew the marriage didn't make sense. He thought Josh was making a terrible mistake staying with Amber, but Josh did stay for the baby, for hope that things might change. For love, or whatever complicated emotion kept him tethered to this increasingly dangerous relationship. By early June of 2011, Amber was 7 months pregnant. Josh was planning his escape. The morning of June 7th began like many others in apartment 2509. Josh and Amber were in their high-rise home, with all of Tulsa spreading out below them through those large windows. But this day was different. Josh had made a decision. He had called his father and told him he wanted to leave. He wanted a divorce. He wanted custody of the baby. He couldn't continue watching Amber use drugs while pregnant. Patrick wanted to help his son, wanted to give him a ride away from the apartment, but he couldn't get off work. Josh would have to wait. Inside the apartment, Josh had begun packing. His bags were ready. The evidence would later show that he was preparing to leave that very day. The marriage was over, even if the final words hadn't been spoken yet. Sometime during the day, maintenance workers arrived at the building to perform repairs. A man named Eladio Rosales was among them. He would later become an important witness, someone who could testify to what he heard and saw that day. The argument began in the living room. According to Amber's later account, they were yelling at each other, standing about 5 to 6 feet apart. The fight was about Josh leaving, about the dissolution of their marriage, about all the pain and anger and fear that had built up over months of conflict. Amber's version of events. The story she would tell repeatedly in interviews during her trial, and in the years that followed, went like this. Josh reached toward her. He grabbed her by the shoulders and began to shake her. Amber, thinking of her unborn baby, pushed Josh away from her to protect herself and her child. Josh lost his balance. He stumbled backward, and then in a moment that would change everything, he fell through the window that should have been stronger, the window that was made of glass too thin for a high-rise building. The window that shattered on impact, sending Josh tumbling into open air. The neighbor in the adjacent apartment reported hearing the sounds of a fight, then silence, then screaming. Josh fell 17 stories. The drop took approximately 3 to 4 seconds. He landed on the concrete roof of the 8th floor parking garage. At just 23 years old, Joshua Blaine Hilberling was dead. Amber's reaction was immediate and desperate. She ran to the elevator and rode down to the 1st floor, searching frantically for Josh. When she couldn't find him there, she looked up and realized where he must have landed. The parking garage roof. She rushed to the elevator again, joined by the apartment manager who tried to calm her down, tried to prevent her from making a scene. But Amber was beyond calm. When she reached the parking garage, she ran to Josh's body. The scene was horrific. The fall from 17 stories had caused catastrophic injuries. Medical examiners would later document that Josh had broken bones in both arms, both legs, most of his ribs, his sternum, his pelvis, and his neck. His lungs were bruised, his liver and spleen lacerated, his kidneys injured. The trauma was absolute, but Amber didn't see a body beyond help. She saw her husband. She screamed for someone to save him. She kissed his face. Despite the obvious severity of his injuries, she begged for paramedics to help him, to bring him back. Officer Don Holloway was among the first police to arrive at the scene. He found chaos. Paramedics working on a body that was clearly beyond saving. Amber hysterical. Witnesses gathering. Holloway's first thoughts went to suicide, or accidental fall. Murder was the furthest thing from his mind. He approached Amber gently, separated her from the body, and suggested that he take her down to the detective division of the Tulsa Police Department. During the ride, Amber remained incredibly upset. She kept asking Holloway if the paramedics were still working on Josh, if they had brought him back to life. Amber's grandmother arrived at some point during the chaos. Together, Amber and her grandmother were taken to the police department. At this point, Amber was not a suspect. She was a witness, a grieving widow. The police wanted her statement, wanted to understand what had happened. What the police didn't fully realize yet was that they were about to receive a confession. The video footage from the Tulsa Police Department interrogation room would become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case against Amber Hilberling. The recordings captured Amber in the hours immediately following Josh's death. still in shock, still processing what had happened. Amber was placed in the interrogation room with her grandmother. The police were recording, though they were not actively interrogating her. They were simply listening, documenting, letting Amber speak, and speak she did. In the recording, Amber can be heard saying, "I'm a horrible person. I pushed my husband and made him fall out the window." She repeated several times that she couldn't stop seeing Josh falling to his death. She wondered aloud if he knew he was dying as he fell. Did he say a prayer? Did he curse her name? The thoughts tormented her, played out in real time on the video. Her grandmother tried to help, telling Amber she was in shock, advising her not to speak to police without an attorney present. But the damage from a legal perspective was already done. Later in the recording, Amber could be heard saying more. She talked about how Josh's parents had warned that if she and Josh stayed together, she would kill him. The prophetic nature of that statement couldn't have been lost on the investigators watching and listening. There were also statements that seemed to contradict what would later become her defense. At one point, she said something to the effect of, "He was messing with the TV and I pushed him." This suggested a different scenario than the self-defense narrative that would emerge during the trial. When news of the incident began to spread, when Josh's family learned what had happened, the reactions were immediate and unambiguous. Josh's father, Patrick, told investigators that when he saw the police chaplain, he knew immediately that Amber had killed his son. "She finally did it," he said. The implication was clear. The family had been expecting something like this. They had seen the violence, had heard Josh's concerns, had witnessed the deterioration of the relationship. On June 8, 2011, just one day after Josh's death, Amber Michelle Hilberling was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The investigation into Josh's death moved quickly. Detectives examined the apartment, looking for signs of what had happened in those final moments. What they found was telling. The apartment showed no signs of a struggle. Furniture was in place. Nothing was knocked over or broken, except for the window itself. The scene suggested that whatever violence had occurred, it had been brief and localized to the area near the window. Detectives found the protective order that Josh had filed against Amber just weeks earlier. They found Josh's packed bags, confirming that he had been planning to leave. These pieces of evidence painted a picture of a man trying to escape a dangerous relationship. The window itself became a focal point. The glass was thin, thinner than modern building codes would require for a high-rise. The University Club Tower had been built in 1966, and the windows had never been upgraded to meet more stringent safety standards. A window expert would later testify that the glass was equivalent to what might be found in picture frames, utterly inadequate for a building of that height. This raised complicated questions. If Amber had pushed Josh, which she admitted doing, but the window shouldn't have broken so easily, was she fully responsible for his death? Or did the faulty window bear some of the blame? The medical examiner's findings left no doubt about the cause of death. Josh had died from multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a fall from a great height. The specific pattern of injuries couldn't determine whether Josh had gone through the window face first or back first, which became important for determining whether he had been pushed from behind or had fallen backward during a confrontation. As the case developed, both the prosecution and the defense began to build their narratives. The prosecution saw a clear case of murder. Amber had a history of violence toward Josh. She had thrown a lamp at him hard enough to require medical attention. She had admitted on camera to pushing him out the window. She was volatile, possibly using drugs, and when Josh tried to leave her, she killed him in a fit of rage. The defense saw something different. They saw a young woman in an abusive relationship who had acted in self-defense. Yes, she pushed Josh, but only after he grabbed her while she was 7 months pregnant. The push was defensive, meant to get him away from her and protect her unborn child. The window breaking was a tragic accident, an unforeseeable consequence of faulty building maintenance. The state offered Amber a plea deal. If she would plead guilty to killing Josh, they would recommend just 5 years in prison. Given that she'd already served time in jail, awaiting trial, she could potentially be out in a few years. She could raise her baby, she could rebuild her life. Amber refused. She would not admit to intentionally killing her husband. She maintained that she never meant for Josh to die, that the window wasn't supposed to break, that this was a terrible accident during a moment of self-defense. So the case went to trial. In March of 2013, nearly 2 years after Josh's death, Amber Hilberling's trial began in Tulsa County District Court. Judge Kurt G. Glasgow presided. The case had garnered significant media attention, with the narrative of a beautiful young woman accused of killing her Air Force veteran husband capturing national interest. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They showed the jury the crime scene video, the same footage that showed Josh's broken body on the parking garage roof. They displayed photographs of his catastrophic injuries, images so disturbing that they were projected on the courtroom wall for everyone to see. Jurors, family members, everyone in that courtroom had to confront the brutal reality of what had happened to Josh. The medical examiner testified in detail about Josh's injuries. Both arms broken, both legs broken, most ribs fractured, sternum shattered, pelvis crushed, neck broken. The internal injuries were just as severe. It was a level of trauma that made clear there had been no chance of survival. The prosecution played the interrogation room videos. The jury heard Amber say, "I'm a horrible person. I pushed my husband and made him fall out the window." They heard her wonder if Josh had cursed her name as he fell. They heard the raw, unfiltered thoughts of someone who had just caused another person's death. The prosecution emphasized Amber's history of violence. They brought up the lamp-throwing incident, the protective order, the documented pattern of abuse that Josh had endured. They pointed to Josh's packed bags as evidence that he was trying to escape, that on the very day he died, he was planning to leave Amber for good. The defense had a different story to tell. Amber herself took the stand, which is always a risky move in a murder trial. She testified that she and Josh were arguing because she had told him she wanted a divorce. During the argument, she said Josh grabbed her by the shoulders. She was 7 months pregnant, and her first thought was protecting her baby. She pushed him away, not intending to hurt him, certainly not intending to send him through a window and to his death. The defense called a window expert, who testified about the inadequacy of the glass in the University Club tower. He explained that the windows were not up to code, that they were far too thin for a high-rise building. The expert's testimony supported the theory that the window breaking was not something Amber could have reasonably anticipated. The defense also emphasized that Josh had his own history of violence. They referenced the Air Force incident where Josh had allegedly thrown a plate at Amber and tried to damage her breast implants. They painted a picture of mutual combat, two people who hurt each other, trapped in a cycle of violence. Amber's attorneys pointed out that there were fingerprint marks and scratches on Amber's shoulders, consistent with her claim that Josh had grabbed her. The defense argued that this was a case of imperfect self-defense, that Amber had acted to protect herself, but that the response had led to an unintended tragedy. The jury deliberated on whether they believed Amber's version of events or the prosecution's interpretation. Was this self-defense gone wrong, or was this an angry, violent woman who pushed her husband out a window in a rage? On March 18, 2013, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The guilty verdict was devastating to Amber and her family. They had genuinely believed that a jury would see the case as a tragic accident, that the evidence of Josh's own violent behavior would create reasonable doubt. The jury recommended a sentence of 25 years in prison. On April 23, 2013, Judge Glasgow formally sentenced Amber to that full 25 years. He also fined her $10,000 and ordered her to pay over $6,000 to the Victims' Compensation Fund. In their sentencing memorandum, prosecutors noted that while Amber had no prior criminal history, she had been well aware that her relationship with Josh was volatile, and that she had acted out violently toward him before. The pattern was established, they argued, and it had culminated in Josh's death. Amber's defense attorneys asked for leniency, pointing out that Amber and Josh had brought a baby into the world when they were really still babies themselves. They emphasized that their son Levi, who was almost 18 months old at sentencing, would be in his 20s by the time his mother was released, if she served the full sentence. The judge was unmoved. The sentence stood. Amber maintained her innocence even after conviction. She filed appeals, arguing that evidence had been improperly admitted, that she had received ineffective assistance of counsel, that there had been prosecutorial misconduct. Her attorneys specifically challenged the use of the interrogation room videos, arguing that recording her without her knowledge had violated her Fourth Amendment rights. The appeals court rejected every argument. The conviction was upheld. While legal battles played out in courtrooms, Amber sat in the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center in McLeod, Oklahoma, a women's prison where she would serve her time. Her son Levi was being raised by family members. The boy would grow up knowing his mother through prison visits and phone calls, if at all. In 2015, Amber was interviewed by Dr. Phil McGraw for his television show. The host traveled to the prison to speak with her. During the interview, Amber told her story again. She described how Josh had grabbed her during the argument, how she had screamed that he was a coward, how she had pushed him off of her. The window wasn't supposed to happen, she said. It was a refrain she would repeat for the rest of her life. The interview gave viewers insight into Amber's state of mind years into her sentence. She seemed genuinely tormented by what had happened, insistent that she had loved Josh deeply, that to intentionally kill someone she loved so much was implausible. Dateline NBC also did an extensive feature on the case, interviewing Amber, her family, Josh's family, attorneys, investigators, and the window expert. The program presented the case in depth, allowing viewers to see the complexity and tragedy from multiple angles. But while Amber told her story to television cameras, while appeals were filed and denied, while the legal system ground slowly forward, something else was happening in the prison. Amber's mental state was deteriorating. Prison is difficult for anyone, but for a young woman who had come from a wealthy family, who had grown up with every advantage, the experience was particularly brutal. Amber was serving her time at Mabel Bassett Correctional Center, a facility that was overcrowded, understaffed, and plagued by the kinds of problems that afflict many state prisons. Oklahoma has the highest incarceration rate in the United States, for both men and women. The state's punitive sentencing policies, combined with inadequate funding for corrections, have created a system that warehouses people rather than rehabilitating them. Mabel Bassett was operating at overcapacity, with over 1,200 women in a facility built for 1,280. During her time in prison, Amber was accused of various disciplinary infractions. According to Department of Corrections records, she faced accusations of indecent exposure and failed multiple drug tests. In December of 2011, shortly after entering the system, she tested positive for marijuana on 2 separate occasions. These infractions painted a picture of someone struggling to adapt to prison life, someone who was perhaps self-medicating to cope with the trauma and guilt of what had happened. But there were more troubling signs than simple disciplinary issues. In the months leading up to October of 2016, Amber's behavior became increasingly concerning. She had been prescribed psychotropic medications for mental health issues. But according to a later lawsuit filed by her mother, Amber was not consistently receiving these medications. Amber had also been cutting herself. She had scars on her wrists and forearms, the telltale signs of someone in profound psychological distress. Self-harm in prison is a red flag that correctional staff are trained to watch for, a warning sign that an inmate may be suicidal. Whether the staff at Mabel Bassett were properly monitoring Amber's mental health would later become a matter of legal dispute. Just 3 days before her death, Amber sent a letter to an ABC affiliate news station in Tulsa, agreeing to their request for an interview. In the letter, she wrote that she couldn't let go of the hope that using her own voice to talk about her own life would be the one chance she had to change the circumstances of her reality. It was the letter of someone desperate to be heard, to be understood, to somehow alter the trajectory of her life. On October 24, 2016, at approximately 5:33 in the afternoon, correctional officers found Amber Hilberling hanging in her cell. Staff attempted to revive her, working for 15 minutes to bring her back. But it was too late. Amber was pronounced dead at 25 years old, having served just over 3 years of her 25-year sentence. The medical examiner ruled the death a suicide by hanging. The autopsy revealed that Amber had methamphetamine in her system at the time of her death, along with the cuts on her wrists and forearms that indicated she had been self-harming. The official story was simple. A young woman serving time for murder had taken her own life in prison. It happens. Prisons are places where despair can overwhelm even the strongest will to survive. But Amber's family didn't accept this conclusion. Amber's mother, Rhonda Whitlock, appeared on Dr. Phil's show after her daughter's death. The grief was evident, but so was the anger and the suspicion. Rhonda told Dr. Phil that she didn't believe Amber had killed herself. She believed her daughter had been murdered in prison. She pointed to several concerning factors surrounding Amber's death. The lawsuit that Rhonda filed, acting as agent of Amber's estate, accused the Oklahoma Department of Corrections of inadequate supervision and classification that permitted the manipulation, coercion, and sexual exploitation of Amber throughout her detention. The lawsuit alleged that on the day of Amber's death, several security failures had occurred. Surveillance equipment was inoperable. Security checks were either not being conducted or were so inadequate that inmates could obscure activities inside their cells by covering the windows and the cell doors. The suit claimed that in the months before her death, prison officials had failed to protect Amber from fellow prisoners with well-known predator tendencies. It alleged inadequate medical and mental health care, noting that Amber wasn't consistently receiving the psychotropic medications she'd been prescribed. These were serious accusations, painting a picture of a prison system that had failed to keep a vulnerable inmate safe. The Department of Corrections defended themselves, arguing that the lawsuit lacked specificity and should be dismissed. They refused to comment beyond their court filings. The case moved slowly through the legal system. For a time, it looked like Rhonda might win some accountability, some acknowledgement that the system had failed her daughter. But in 2019, the lawsuit was dropped. The reasons for dropping it aren't entirely clear from public records, but the result was that no court would ever make official findings about whether prison officials bore responsibility for Amber's death. Rhonda maintained publicly that she believed Amber was innocent of Josh's murder, that the couple had been mutually combative, and that Josh's death had been a terrible accident. She also maintained that her daughter had been murdered in prison, though she could never prove it. The questions lingered. Was Amber's death really a suicide? Or was something more sinister happening in the Oklahoma prison system? Was a troubled young woman failed by institutions that should have protected her? There are no clear answers to these questions. Like so much in the story of Joshua and Amber Hilberling, the truth is complicated, contested, and ultimately unknowable. In the years since these events, the case of Joshua and Amber Hilberling has continued to generate discussion and debate. It was featured on television programs like Women Who Kill and Dateline. Articles have been written, podcasts have covered it. A book was even published about the case. Public opinion remains divided. Some people see Amber as a cold-blooded killer who murdered her husband in rage when he tried to leave her. Others see her as a victim of domestic violence who defended herself and was then failed by a justice system that didn't fully understand the dynamics of mutually abusive relationships. The physical evidence is ambiguous enough to support both interpretations. The broken window, the packed bags, the protective order, the admitted push, the scratches on Amber's shoulders. All of it can be read in multiple ways. Josh's family has always maintained that Amber murdered their son. They believe the jury got it right. They grieve for Josh and for the future he never got to have, for the father he never got to be. Amber's family believes she was wrongly convicted, that the push was defensive, that the window's inadequacy was the real cause of Josh's death. They grieve for Amber and believe the system failed her twice, first in convicting her of murder, and again in failing to prevent her death in prison. Little Levi, the baby who was born just months after his father's death, grew up without either parent. He was raised by extended family members, carrying the weight of a tragedy he never chose and couldn't understand. By the time his mother died, he was around 5 years old enough to have some memories of prison visits, but too young to fully grasp what had happened to his family. The University Club Tower still stands in downtown Tulsa. The window on the 17th floor has long since been replaced. Life continues in the building, with new residents who may or may not know about the tragedy that occurred there on June 7th, 2011. The case raises questions that extend beyond just one couple's troubled relationship. It forces us to think about domestic violence in all its forms, including situations where both partners are violent. It makes us consider how the justice system handles cases where self-defense claims are complicated by a history of mutual aggression. It also makes us think about what happens to people in prison, especially young people serving long sentences for crimes committed in moments of rage or fear. Amber entered prison at 21. She died at 25. Those 4 years represented nearly 20% of her entire life, and they broke something in her that couldn't be fixed. Whether you believe Amber was a murderer who got what she deserved, or a troubled young woman who made a terrible mistake in a moment of fear, or something in between, the fact remains that 2 young people are dead. A child grew up without parents. 2 families are forever scarred by loss and anger, and unanswerable questions. As we come to the end of this story, take a moment to just breathe. The details will fade as you drift towards sleep. That's okay, you don't need to remember every fact, every date, every name. What remains is the human tragedy at the core of this case. 2 young people who met and fell in love, who made choices that led them to a high-rise apartment in Oklahoma, to an argument on a summer day, to a window that wasn't strong enough, to 17 stories of fall time that ended everything. Joshua Hilberling never got to meet his son. He never got to grow old. His life ended violently, painfully, in a way no one deserves. Amber Hilberling never got to raise her child. She spent the last years of her life in a prison cell, tormented by what happened, insisting until the end that she never meant for Josh to die. Their story is a reminder that domestic violence is complicated, that relationships can be toxic in ways that endanger everyone involved, that quick decisions made in moments of anger or fear can have consequences that echo for years. It's a reminder that the justice system, for all its procedures and rules, can't always give us the neat answers we want. Sometimes guilt is clear. Sometimes it's murky. Sometimes reasonable people looking at the same evidence reach completely different conclusions. And it's a reminder that prisons are places where vulnerable people can fall through the cracks, where mental health crises can end in tragedy, where the systems meant to contain and rehabilitate can instead destroy. As you drift off to sleep, let these thoughts settle gently. Tomorrow, this story will be just a memory, something you heard once in the quiet hours of night. But for now, in this moment, we've remembered Joshua and Amber, two people whose lives became entwined in tragedy. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Murder of Lauren Astley. Tonight we're traveling to a quiet corner of Massachusetts, to a town where everyone knew everyone, where teenagers went to football games on Friday nights and spent summers by the lake. It's a story about young love, about the fragile nature of teenage relationships, and about a tragedy that would shake an entire community to its core. This is a story that matters. Not because of its darkness, but because of what came after, because of the light that emerged from unspeakable pain. So breathe deeply, let yourself relax, and listen. Wayland, Massachusetts is the kind of town that appears in postcards. Nestled in the Metro West region of the state, just 18 miles west of Boston, it's a peaceful, semi-rural community where the Sudbury River winds through marshes and meadows that have remained relatively untouched for centuries. The population hovers around 14,000 people. Families choose to settle here for the excellent school system, consistently ranked among the best in the Commonwealth. It's a place where parents feel safe, where children ride bikes down tree-lined streets, where neighbors still wave to each other. The town takes pride in its history. Founded in 1638 as part of the Sudbury Plantation, it was incorporated as East Sudbury in 1780 before being renamed Wayland in 1835. After Reverend Francis Wayland, the president of Brown University, the community established one of the first free public libraries in Massachusetts back in 1848. This is a town that values education, community, and the preservation of its natural beauty. In the summer of 2011, Wayland was exactly what it appeared to be, a safe haven. A bedroom community where urban professionals raised their families in quiet comfort. The kind of place where everyone assumed their children were protected from the darker realities of the world. That assumption would be shattered. Lauren Dunn Astley was 18 years old in the summer of 2011. She had just graduated from Wayland High School, and her whole life stretched out before her like an open road. Her friends described her as the girl next door. Warm, kind, creative. She had dreams of becoming a fashion designer, and that fall she was planning to attend Elon University in North Carolina. She worked at Shop 344, a clothing boutique at the Natick Collection Mall. Gaining experience in the industry she hoped to make her career. Lauren was an only child, deeply loved by her parents, Malcolm Astley and Mary Dunn. Malcolm served on the Wayland School Committee, invested in the community that had embraced their family. Lauren sang in her high school's vocal group, her voice carrying through the auditorium at performances. She was part of a tight-knit group of girlfriends who supported each other through the ups and downs of teenage life. She had that rare quality of being genuinely well-liked without trying to be. Nathaniel Fujita, who went by Nate, was also 18. He had been Lauren's boyfriend for 3 years. 3 years is an eternity in high school time, a relationship that spanned the majority of their adolescence. Nate was a football player, graceful and athletic, and he ran track as well. Lauren would sit in the stands watching him play. He would come to her vocal performances. To their friends, they seemed like a natural pair. Nate came from a family that was well respected in the community. His father, Tomohisa Fujita, known as Tomo, was an assistant professor of guitar at the prestigious Berklee College of Music. The two families had grown close over the years, so close that Lauren had even interviewed Nate's father for a school project, a video posted on YouTube in June of 2010. The footage shows a comfortable familiarity, a teenager at ease with what felt like a second family. The relationship between Lauren and Nate had begun when they were just 14 years old in their sophomore year of high school. Malcolm Astley, Lauren's father, would later describe their relationship as having a certain comfort and mellowness. They seemed to understand each other, but like many teenage relationships, it wasn't always smooth. They would break up and get back together, cycling through the emotional intensity that comes with first love. Lauren's closest friends noticed patterns that concerned them. Sometimes Lauren would gush about Nate, saying he was cute and fun. Other times she would vent her frustrations. He was boring, she'd complain. He was on his phone the whole time. She was over it. Her friends created a Facebook thread, a private conversation where they listed all the reasons Lauren should break up with Nate. It was the kind of thing teenage girls do, supporting a friend through relationship troubles, never imagining the consequences that might follow. In April of 2011, on her 18th birthday, Lauren made a decision. She ended the relationship with Nathaniel Fujita for good. It was April 1st. She was ready to move forward with her life, to go to college, to meet new people, to discover who she was beyond the identity of being someone's girlfriend. For Nate, the breakup was devastating. Friends noticed immediate changes in his behavior. He became withdrawn, less social. The depression was visible. He stopped looking forward to college. Nothing seemed to matter to him anymore. One childhood friend would later testify that Nate seemed to lose all motivation for life after Lauren left him. But Lauren tried to do the kind thing. She attempted to maintain a friendship. In the beginning of summer, after graduation, Lauren and her friends threw a party. It was meant to be a celebration, the traditional marking of the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Nate was invited, included in the gathering of their mutual friend group. The party would reveal the depth of Nate's pain. He arrived intoxicated. When he saw Lauren talking to other guys, something inside him snapped. He approached her, angry, demanding her attention. She refused. She asked him to leave her alone. Lauren went to her mother, crying. "He will not leave me alone," she said. "He's harassing me. He doesn't want me to dance with anybody." Nate's rage escalated. He punched one of the poles holding up the tent where 150 partygoers were gathered. The tent collapsed. He was asked to leave. Looking back, Lauren's mother, Mary Dunn, would recognize these as warning signs, but at the time she explained the signs were very soft. She thought it was just teenage behavior. In retrospect, she would pay attention to different things. The amount of time Lauren spent at Nate's house instead of her own. The fact that Lauren's best friends didn't like him at all. As summer progressed, Nate's condition worsened. His family became deeply concerned. He stopped hanging out with his friends entirely. He began drinking heavily. His mother, Beth Fujita, was so worried about her son that she took an extraordinary step. She went to Lauren's workplace at the mall and asked if Lauren would be willing to reach out to Nate, to talk to him, to try to understand what was happening to him. Lauren agreed. It was an act of compassion, of friendship, perhaps tinged with guilt about the pain she'd caused. She arranged to meet Nate at his family's home on the evening of July 3rd, 2011. July 3rd was a Sunday. Lauren began her day normally, going to work at the mall. Surveillance footage captured her riding the escalator at 9:45 in the morning, just another teenage girl heading to her shift at the clothing store. Throughout the day, she and Nate exchanged phone calls. There were 3 calls between them. She told her coworkers she planned to meet with him after work. At 6:45 in the evening, security cameras caught Lauren leaving the mall on her phone. She was talking to Nathaniel Fujita. Lauren had plans that night. Her close friend Genevieve was expecting her. The whole friend group was supposed to hang out together. But first, Lauren was going to check on Nate. At 7:05, she sent her final text message. One word. Here. She had arrived at the Fujita house on West Plain Street in Wayland. What happened next took place in the garage. Away from cameras, away from witnesses. Nate would later tell a psychiatrist that they began walking toward the garage to talk. He remembered grabbing a bungee cord. He put it around her neck and began strangling her. He described it as though he wasn't in control of himself, as though his body was acting while his mind was disconnected from what was happening. The medical examiner would later determine that Lauren died from a combination of strangulation and wounds to her neck. The wound was described as horrific, gaping, jagged. After killing Lauren, Nathaniel Fujita engaged in what prosecutors would describe as a calculated cover-up. He took her car keys and drove her Jeep to Wayland Town Beach, where he hid the keys in a storm drain. He changed out of his bloody shoes into another pair of sneakers. He drove Lauren's body to Water Row, a marshy area off Route 27, carrying her body 36 feet into the water. He then drove back home and cleaned up the garage. Later that night, he called his parents and asked them to come home so the family could watch a movie together. He was spotted driving around shirtless with his car windows down and music blaring. He called a cousin, later explaining to prosecutors, "I just wanted to get my mind off of it." When Lauren didn't return home from work that night, her father, Malcolm Astley, filed a missing persons report with the Wayland Police Department. He had been reaching out to her friends, hoping someone had seen her. Around 11 at night, with no word from his daughter, he knew something was terribly wrong. The next morning, July 4th, Independence Day, a bicyclist riding along Water Row made a horrible discovery. Lauren Astley's body, with her throat cut and a bungee cord wrapped around her neck. Police immediately began their investigation. They found Lauren's Jeep at the beach parking lot. They questioned Nathaniel Fujita. He told them that Lauren had visited his home around 7:45, that they'd spoken briefly while she remained in her car, that it had been awkward, and then she'd left. He said she'd parked her car up the road, but investigators were thorough. When they searched the Fujita home, they found blood. Blood in the garage near some bungee cords. Blood in the kitchen. Blood on a bathroom sink. Blood on an exterior door handle. In an attic crawl space above Nate's bedroom, hidden behind ceiling panels, they discovered a plastic bag containing blood-soaked clothing. They found sneakers speckled with blood, a sweatshirt filled with water and dirt, consistent with having been in marshland. 2 days after Lauren's body was found, on July 6th, Nathaniel Fujita was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. The murder horrified Wayland. The town hadn't seen a homicide since 1985. This was a community where people felt safe, where they knew their neighbors, where teenagers were supposed to be protected. And now 2 of their own children, 2 graduates of Wayland High School, 2 young people who had been part of the fabric of the community, were at the center of an unspeakable tragedy. What happened next was remarkable. Malcolm Astley, standing before cameras and microphones, his daughter's body barely cold, chose a path that many would find incomprehensible. He expressed empathy for the Fujita family. "Lauren's mother and I share the anguish of Nate's parents, who put so much caring into Nate, and my daughter as well," he said at the arraignment. "We want them to know that." His response drew attention far beyond Wayland. Commentators and scholars discussed the nature of forgiveness, of empathy in the face of unimaginable pain. Malcolm Astley wasn't excusing what had happened. He was recognizing the complexity of the situation, the tragedy that had befallen both families, the anguish of parents who had loved their children and never imagined such an outcome. The Middlesex District Attorney, Gerard Leone, characterized the case as teen dating violence. Lauren broke off the relationship, he told reporters. "It's a classic fatal paradigm that we see around teen dating relationships. We are very confident it was about power and control. There was no prior indication that Nate had been physically abusive to Lauren during their relationship. No criminal record. No history of violence. But after the breakup, friends had noticed changes. Nate had become less social, angrier. He'd been calling Lauren repeatedly at work. The on-again, off-again nature of their relationship after April had created a pattern of instability. It took a year and a half for the case to come to trial. On February 13th, 2013, jury selection began. Nathaniel Fujita sat in the courtroom, mostly keeping his face down. When he looked up, his friends from high school said he looked like someone they'd never known. Genevieve Flynn, one of Lauren's close friends, described it this way. "There's 2 different people. There's the Nate that was in high school with us, who was in my homeroom, who would joke around with me, who was on the track team with me. There's that Nate. Then there's the Nate, who I have only really seen in handcuffs and in a courtroom." Prosecutor Lisa McGovern didn't mince words in her opening statement. "This defendant is guilty exactly as charged," she said. "Nathaniel Fujita was hurt by Lauren Astley not coming back to him, and he killed her." The prosecution's case was straightforward. They argued that Nate had been angry about the breakup and had carefully planned Lauren's murder. He had lured her to his home when he knew his parents wouldn't be there. He'd had her park her car out of sight. He'd strangled and stabbed her. He'd disposed of her body. He'd covered his tracks. But the defense took a different approach. Nate's attorney, William Sullivan, admitted from the start that Nathaniel had killed Lauren. "In most murder cases, the question is who. Who did it?" he told the court. "That's not this case. This case, there's going to be 2 questions, why and how." The defense argued that Nathaniel Fujita was not criminally responsible for his actions due to mental illness. They claimed he had experienced a temporary psychotic episode at the time of the killing, that he lacked the ability to control his actions or understand what he was doing. Dr. Wade Myers, a psychiatrist who evaluated Nathaniel after the murder, testified for the defense. He described how Nate had told him about grabbing the bungee cord and strangling Lauren, but that it was as though he wasn't controlling himself. His body was acting while his mind was disconnected. Nate's mother had been so concerned about her son's mental state that she'd taken him to see a psychiatrist before the murder. The defense pointed to depression, daily marijuana use, and repeated brain injuries from playing football as contributing factors to a psychotic break. But the prosecution presented a different picture. Their psychiatric expert testified that Fujita had acted out of rage, not psychosis, and they focused heavily on his actions after the killing. The methodical cover-up, taking the car keys, hiding them in a drain, changing his shoes, disposing of the body, cleaning the garage, calling his parents to come home for a movie night. Say what you will about fairy godmothers. Prosecutor Lisa McGovern told the jury, "There is no psychosis fairy who magically sprinkled a temporary dose of psychosis on this defendant. The evidence shows, yes, he took the car to the beach. He hid the keys in the drain. He changed out of his bloody shoes into another pair of sneakers. He drives Lauren Astley's body to the marsh. He carries it 36 feet into the water. He drives back home. He cleans up the garage. He wasn't exhibiting a single symptom of psychosis. He was criminally responsible." The trial was excruciating for everyone involved. For Lauren's friends and family, listening to the details of her death, testifying about their memories of her. Genevieve Flynn described testifying as incredibly emotional. "I wanted to say the right thing to make sure the right thing happened for her," she said through tears. It was equally agonizing for the Fujita family. George Mattingly, Nate's uncle, would later say that Nate seemed bewildered. "I don't think he understands to this day why the killing of Lauren took place," he said. Malcolm Astley, even in the midst of his grief, maintained his compassionate stance. "Our children make mistakes, even horrible, horrible mistakes," he said. "That doesn't remove our caring." On March 7, 2013, after deliberating the evidence, the jury reached their verdict. They found Nathaniel Fujita guilty of first-degree murder with premeditation and extreme atrocity or cruelty. He was also found guilty on several counts of assault and battery. When the verdict was read, Mary Dunn, Lauren's mother, broke down in tears and hugged the prosecutor. The Fujitas reportedly broke down as well, and they hugged Malcolm Astley before leaving the courtroom. Nathaniel showed no emotion as the verdict was announced. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The sentencing came that same afternoon. Both of Lauren's parents delivered victim impact statements before the court. Mary Dunn spoke of a loss so profound it defied description. "I do not know how I will fully live again without my daughter," she told the court. "Never again will I be called Mom. I miss her voice desperately." Malcolm Astley suggested that Nathaniel use whatever skills he had to help others while spending the rest of his life in prison. It would be, he said, a notable gift of atonement in Lauren's memory. The sentence was mandatory for first-degree murder, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nathaniel Fujita was 20 years old. In the years that followed, Malcolm Astley and Mary Dunn chose to channel their grief into something constructive. They created the Lauren Dunn Astley Memorial Fund to promote educational programs on healthy teen relationships, the arts, and community service. The statistics are sobering. According to the National Teen Dating Abuse Helpline, teen dating abuse affects nearly 1.5 million high school students nationwide every year. Many young people don't recognize the warning signs. They don't understand that love shouldn't involve control, isolation, or fear. Malcolm and Mary have traveled to over 250 schools and colleges. They've attended summits. They've met with governors. They used the CBS 48 Hours documentary about Lauren's murder, titled Love to Death, to raise awareness. In Wayland, Lauren's story has become part of the wellness curriculum. Starting in 5th grade, students learn about healthy friendships. As they progress through middle school and high school, the conversations evolve to address unhealthy relationships, dating violence, and warning signs to watch for. Malcolm Astley has become an advocate for young people navigating relationships. When asked what he would tell someone struggling in a relationship, he offers clear advice. If one person's world is shrinking in a relationship, there is a problem, and help should be sought from a trusted peer or adult who knows what the school and community resources are for help. A trusted teacher, a counselor, or a nurse is often a good place to start. The fund has created programs that begin with teaching children about healthy friendships before they even start dating. The idea is to build a foundation of understanding about what respectful relationships look like, so that when romantic relationships begin, young people have the tools to recognize red flags. Students at Wayland High School have responded positively to these programs. One student said, "I found it quite informative and helpful in knowing how to get out of unhealthy relationships. The discussions we had in class were rather eye-opening regarding what people deemed healthy or not. So healthy. I'm very glad it's offered at the high school." A mural honoring Lauren was created by her friends on an exterior wall of the Wayland High School courtyard. It stands as a permanent reminder of a life that held so much promise, and of the importance of recognizing when relationships become dangerous. The story didn't end with the conviction. In 2015, while serving his sentence in a New Hampshire prison due to a Department of Correction agreement between Massachusetts and New Hampshire, Nathaniel Fujita was found in his cell mute, non-responsive, and rigidly posturing. He was taken to an emergency room and given antipsychotic medication. He improved and was returned to the prison. But this was, according to his later legal filings, the beginning of a 2-year period of severe psychiatric crisis. Initially, facility staff believed he was malingering, exaggerating symptoms. They didn't give him antipsychotic medication for nearly a year and a half. During this time, records showed that Fujita was often mute, sometimes exhibited hypersexual behavior, stopped showering, and his cell became covered with food, feces, and urine. At one point, he lost 27 pounds in a 4-month period. In 2024, Nathaniel's attorneys filed for a new trial, arguing that psychiatric issues, specifically schizophrenia, had emerged after his incarceration and would have been impossible to diagnose at the time of the original trial. They claimed this constituted new evidence that should be considered. The Middlesex District Court judge denied the request for a retrial in 2023. Fujita's attorneys appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in June of 2024, claiming the judge had been negligent and applied faulty reasoning. Additionally, in 2024, Massachusetts law changed in a way that could affect Fujita's sentence. The court raised the minimum age to be sentenced to life in prison without parole to 21. This meant that anyone sentenced to life without parole when they were under 21 became eligible for a chance at parole if the crime was committed before July 25, 2014. Lauren's friends responded to the appeal with a joint statement. Not only does asking for an appeal based on an admitted faked or exaggerated mental illness give folks suffering from these real diseases a bad rap and make their paths harder, but it makes it even more clear how selfish he is. They wrote, "We have never heard one iota of regret or responsibility from him. We don't expect to." As of early 2025, prosecutors had asked the Supreme Judicial Court to uphold the lower court's denial of a retrial. A hearing date had not yet been set. So what do we make of this story? How do we understand what happened on that July evening in Wayland? The easy answer is to call it a case of teen dating violence and move on. To categorize it, file it away, and forget about it. But the truth is more complex. Nathaniel Fujita had no history of violence, no prior criminal record. Friends described him as someone who joked around, who ran track, who seemed incapable of such an act. The two families had been close. Lauren had interviewed his father for a school project, comfortable and smiling in the video footage. And yet, something happened. Whether it was a psychotic break, as the defense argued, or rage and premeditation, as the prosecution maintained, the result was the same. An 18-year-old girl, full of dreams and potential, was strangled and killed by someone she had once loved. The warning signs were there, soft as they were. The isolation, the amount of time he wanted her at his house, the anger when she talked to other people, the collapse of the tent at the graduation party, the persistent phone calls to her workplace, friends who didn't like him. But these signs are often visible only in hindsight. Teenage relationships are notoriously dramatic. Breaking up and getting back together is common. Jealousy, possessiveness, these can seem like intense emotions rather than dangerous red flags. How do you distinguish normal teenage angst from something that could turn deadly? This is the work that Malcolm Astley and Mary Dunn have dedicated themselves to, teaching young people and the adults in their lives to recognize the difference, to understand that healthy relationships expand your world while unhealthy ones shrink it, to know that it's okay to walk away, to ask for help, to trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Lauren's story matters not because of how she died, but because of what her parents have built from their grief. Every student who learns to recognize an unhealthy relationship, every young person who finds the courage to leave before it's too late, every parent who learns to look for the soft signs, every teacher who knows how to respond when a student confides in them. These are Lauren's legacy. The town of Wayland, that peaceful community by the Sudbury River, was forever changed. They learned that tragedy can happen anywhere, that safety is not guaranteed by good schools and tree-lined streets. that the darkness can find its way into even the quietest corners. But they also learned about resilience, about the power of turning pain into purpose, about the importance of talking about difficult things, of educating rather than avoiding, of facing hard truths in order to prevent future tragedies. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let this story settle in your mind, not as a tale of horror, but as a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of compassion. Think of Malcolm Astley standing in that courtroom, choosing empathy over hatred. Think of Mary Dunn channeling her grief into protecting other children. Think of Lauren's friends creating a mural to remember her, speaking out against violence, refusing to let her death be meaningless. Teen dating violence affects over 1 million young people every year. It happens in wealthy suburbs and poor neighborhoods. It crosses all boundaries of race, class, and culture. The statistics are clear. Breaking up is one of the most dangerous times in an abusive relationship. When someone loses control over another person, when the relationship ends against their wishes, the risk of violence increases dramatically. But knowledge is power. Education saves lives. When young people understand what healthy relationships look like, when they can identify red flags, when they know that help is available, outcomes can be different. Lauren Astley was 18 years old. She loved fashion. She sang in her school's vocal group. She had been accepted to Elon University. She had dreams. She had a future. All of it was taken away on a summer evening in a garage in Wayland, Massachusetts. But her story didn't end there. It continues in every classroom where her parents speak, in every student who learns from her experience, in every young person who recognizes a warning sign and gets help, in every life saved by the education and awareness that her death helped create. Rest now. Let the weight of this story remind you that every life matters, that every choice we make ripples outward in ways we cannot fully comprehend, and that from even the darkest tragedy, light can emerge if we choose to carry it forward. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. The Disappearance and Murder of Caitlyn Markham. Tonight we're going to explore a case that unfolded over more than a decade. A mystery that gripped a small Ohio community and left a family searching desperately for answers. This is the story of Caitlyn Markham, a vibrant young artist, whose life was tragically cut short, and the long winding path to justice that followed. As we move through this narrative, let the details wash over you gently. There's no need to hold on to every word. Just let the story carry you along. Take another breath, let your eyes close, and let's begin. In the summer of 2011, the Cincinnati suburb of Fairfield, Ohio, was like many small American communities. With a population of just over 40,000 people, it was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, where children played in tree-lined streets, and where life moved at a comfortable, predictable pace. In this quiet community lived a young woman named Caitlyn Markham. Born on August 16, 1989, Caitlyn had been adopted as an infant by loving parents who gave her a stable, nurturing home. She grew up alongside her younger sister, Allie, who was 6 years her junior. From the very beginning, Caitlyn was different. She was creative, a little eccentric, thoughtful. She was the kind of person who saw the world through an artist's eyes. Those who knew Caitlyn described her as sweet, outgoing, and cheerful. She had a distinctive presence, often seen with a paintbrush tucked into her hair, always on the lookout for her next creative project. Art wasn't just a hobby for Caitlyn. It was her passion, her calling, the lens through which she understood the world. After graduating from Fairfield High School, Caitlyn pursued her dream. She enrolled at the Art Institute of Ohio in Cincinnati, where she studied graphic design. The program was rigorous, demanding, but Caitlyn thrived. She made friends easily, her positive energy drawing people to her. One classmate, who met her during a typography class in 2009, later said he was immediately drawn to her warmth and optimism. Caitlyn was, in his words, a well of inspiration. By the summer of 2011, Caitlyn was 21 years old and approaching a significant milestone. She was just weeks away from completing her bachelor's degree in graphic arts. She worked at David's Bridal, a wedding dress shop near Tri-County Mall, balancing her job with her studies and her art. She had plans, dreams of what would come next. And she had a fiancé. His name was John Carter. Caitlyn and John had been together for 5 years. They had known each other since their teenage years, growing up in the same community, their lives intertwining in that way that feels inevitable in a small town. A year before Caitlyn disappeared, John had proposed. They were engaged, planning a future together. They talked about moving to Colorado after Caitlyn graduated, starting fresh in a new place, building a life together. From the outside, everything seemed normal. John worked as a pizza delivery driver for Papa John's. He lived with his mother on West Scioto Drive, less than half a mile from Caitlyn's townhouse on Dorshire Drive. It was a 4-minute walk between their homes. They spent time together often, their lives comfortably entwined in the way of young couples planning a future. But beneath the surface, things were more complicated. Relationships often are. In the days before Caitlyn disappeared, she had confided in a friend that she was feeling trapped. She was reconsidering the move to Colorado. She was tired, uncertain about the relationship, questioning whether this was truly what she wanted. She kept these doubts private, not wanting to hurt John, not wanting to cause a scene. But the doubts were there, growing. In John's friend group, people understood something important about him. As one friend would later tell investigators, if Caitlyn were to break up with John, it would be catastrophic. Absolutely catastrophic. August 13th, 2011, was a Saturday. In just 3 days, Caitlyn would turn 22 years old. The summer evening was warm, typical for Ohio in August. Caitlyn was at her townhouse on Dorshire Drive, a modest apartment where she lived with her beloved dog, Murphy. That evening, John Carter came over to visit. According to John's later account to police, a mutual friend named Brad Von Bargen stopped by as well. The three of them spent time together, just hanging out, talking, enjoying each other's company. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed wrong. Just a normal Saturday evening among friends. After Brad left, John said he wanted to continue socializing. He told Caitlyn he was going to meet up with some other friends. Caitlyn decided to stay home. She was tired, and she had Murphy to take care of. John left her townhouse around 11:30 that night, heading off to meet his friends. This would be, according to John, the last time he saw Caitlyn alive. According to phone records, text messages passed between Caitlyn's phone and John's phone that evening. The last text from Caitlyn's phone was sent at 11:36 in the evening. Then, shortly after midnight, around 12:45 in the morning on August 14th, Caitlyn's phone went silent. It was turned off. The GPS device on her phone was also deactivated. At 12:52, just minutes after Caitlyn's phone went dark, a photo was sent from her phone to John's. It was a simple image, the kind you might text to a loved one before bed. But phone records would later show something strange. John claimed he sent Caitlyn a good morning text around 4 in the morning, but the phone records showed no such text was ever sent. John's account of that night was detailed, precise. He said he left Caitlyn's townhouse and went to his friend's gathering. His friends would later confirm he arrived around 11:30 and stayed for a while. Then John said he returned to his mother's house around 1:30 in the morning. He said he watched television on his computer, episodes of one of his favorite shows, before falling asleep around 4 in the morning. But there were witnesses who remembered that night differently. 2 young boys who lived nearby had snuck out of their house in the early morning hours, the way adventurous children sometimes do. They were out exploring the neighborhood when they saw something unusual. They saw John's car, a distinctive red Ford, pulling up to Caitlyn's townhouse around 1:30 in the morning. The car's lights were off, which struck them as odd. They watched as the car stopped briefly, then left again just a few minutes later. A second vehicle was also there, though they couldn't identify it clearly. These boys would tell this story to investigators. They would tell it in 2013, when the case was reopened. And they would tell the same story again in 2023, when investigators re-interviewed them. Their account never changed, but on that Sunday morning, August 14th, none of this was known yet. The sun rose on what seemed like an ordinary day. Sunday, August 14th, 2011. Caitlyn Markham was supposed to work at David's Bridal. She had a shift scheduled, and her coworkers expected to see her, but Caitlyn never showed up. According to John Carter, he woke up that afternoon, later than usual. When he checked his phone, he noticed that Caitlyn still hadn't responded to any of his messages. This was unusual. Caitlyn was good about staying in touch. A sense of concern began to grow in him. John said he drove to Caitlyn's townhouse to check on her. When he arrived, he saw her car parked outside. That was the first sign something was wrong. If Caitlyn had gone somewhere, she would have taken her car. John went to the door, knocked, tried to get inside. There was no answer. Growing more worried, John let himself in. The scene inside the townhouse was unsettling in its ordinariness. Everything was in its place, as if Caitlyn had simply stepped out for a moment. Her purse was there, sitting where she'd left it. Her wallet was on her bed, with her driver's license and $300 in cash still inside. Her keys were there. Most telling of all, her dog Murphy was locked in her bedroom, clearly unattended for many hours. The only thing missing was Caitlyn herself and her cell phone. At 7:59 that evening, John Carter called 911. The recording of that call would be played many times over the years that followed. In it, John's voice sounds urgent, worried. "My fiancée is missing," he tells the dispatcher. "I can't find her anywhere." He explains that he knows police usually wait 24 hours before taking a missing person report, but he insists something is wrong. When Fairfield police officers arrived at the townhouse, they found the scene just as John had described it. Caitlyn's belongings were all there. Her car, her purse, her wallet, her keys. Murphy the dog, hungry and anxious after being locked in the bedroom for hours. But no Caitlyn. During his interview with police that night, officers noticed something. On the left side of John Carter's neck were several red vertical scratch marks. When asked about them, John explained that they were from an electric razor. Later, he would change this story, saying he wasn't sure where the scratches had come from. A friend who had been with John and Caitlyn on the night of August 13th would later tell police that they hadn't noticed any scratches on John's neck that evening. The investigation began as a missing person case. There was no immediate evidence of foul play, no signs of a struggle, no obvious indication that anything violent had occurred. But there was an unsettling wrongness to the scene. Why would a young woman leave her home without her car, without her purse, without her wallet and money, leaving her dog locked in her bedroom? The community responded with an outpouring of support. Volunteers organized search parties, combing through the neighborhoods around Fairfield. Posters with Caitlyn's face went up in business windows throughout the town. Radio and television stations ran the story. An organization called EquoSearch came up from Texas with their horses to search the surrounding areas in those first critical weeks. And John Carter was everywhere, visible in his grief and desperation. He appeared on television, pleading for Caitlyn's return. He gave interviews to local and national media. He appeared twice on CNN's Nancy Grace show. In one interview on NBC's Today Show, he said he was still calling Caitlyn's cell phone daily, hoping she would answer. "Caitlyn is the love of my life," he told reporters. "We've been engaged for a year." Caitlyn's father, Dave Markham, threw himself into the search for his daughter. He organized awareness events, gave interviews, did everything he could to keep Caitlyn's case in the public eye. In April of 2012, 8 months after Caitlyn disappeared, about 70 people gathered at Harbin Park for an event called Hope for Caitlyn. It was a gathering of music, memories, and food, but mostly it was a reminder that the community hadn't forgotten. One of Caitlyn's classmates from the Art Institute said that writing about Caitlyn for the event had been effortless, because Caitlyn herself was a well of inspiration. Dave Markham stood before the crowd that day and expressed both his gratitude and his frustration. "I can't believe 8 months has gone by," he said. "You think something will happen and then another month goes by. The months turned into a year, and then more. Despite the massive search efforts, despite the attention from Texas EquoSearch, despite the media coverage and the interviews and the desperate hoping, there was no sign of Caitlyn Markham." Sunday, April 7th, 2013, nearly 20 months after Caitlyn Markham disappeared. A couple was spending their morning in a wooded area near Big Cedar Creek in Cedar Grove, Indiana. They were looking for scrap metal, aluminum cans, anything they could collect and sell. The area was remote, about 30 miles west of Fairfield, Ohio. It was the kind of place people didn't often visit, cluttered with trash and debris along the creek bed. Andy Hicks, one of the scrap metal collectors, noticed something among the aluminum cans and garbage. It was a jawbone, a human jawbone. Police were called immediately. Indiana State Police, along with investigators from Fairfield, descended on the scene. What they found was devastating. Skeletal remains, partially decomposed and scattered, lay in the wooded area. There was a plastic bag over the skull. The remains had clearly been there for a considerable time, exposed to the elements and wildlife. On April 10, 2013, the remains were positively identified through dental records. They belonged to Caitlyn Markham. The missing woman posters that had hung in Fairfield business windows for nearly 2 years no longer represented hope. They were now a memorial. Dave Markham addressed a crowd of supporters at Fairfield West Baptist Church that evening. "Although we are glad to have Caitlyn home," he said, his voice heavy with grief, "we always had the hope to be able to see her again." Karen Winkler, the mother of John Carter, also spoke about the discovery. "We have had hope that she was going to come home all along," she said. "Now we know, and we have the relief of knowing she's been with God this whole time. But that's the only relief we have." The medical examiner ruled Caitlyn's death a homicide, but determining the cause of death was impossible. The remains were too decomposed, too damaged by time and the elements. However, a forensic anthropology report would later reveal some details. There was evidence of sharp, blunt force trauma to Caitlyn's left wrist bone, 3 or 4 distinct wounds. The report also indicated something else important. The body had not originally been at the location where it was found. It had been moved, placed there after death. The location itself was significant. The wooded area near Big Cedar Creek was less than 2 miles from a farm owned by John Carter's family. The most direct route from John Carter's mother's house on West Scioto Drive to his father's farm in the area passed directly over Big Cedar Road, the road where Caitlyn's body had been discovered. With Caitlyn's remains found and her death confirmed as a homicide, the case took on new urgency. But the investigation was complicated. There was no clear cause of death. There was no physical evidence directly linking anyone to the crime. There were suspicions, theories, people of interest, but nothing concrete enough to make an arrest. John Carter cooperated with the investigation, at least on the surface. He gave interviews to police. He took polygraph tests. The first polygraph was administered on September 19th, 2011, just over a month after Caitlyn disappeared. According to investigators, Carter showed deceptive responses. He took a second polygraph on February 27th, 2014. Again, deceptive responses. A third polygraph was administered on January 28th, 2021. This time, Carter specifically showed deceptive responses when asked whether he had disposed of Caitlyn's body on Big Cedar Road. Despite these results, despite the suspicions, despite the circumstantial evidence beginning to accumulate, no arrest was made. The case grew cold. Years passed. The investigation moved from the Fairfield Police Department to the Butler County Sheriff's Office in 2015, and then to the Butler County Prosecutor's Office in 2020. Different investigators looked at the evidence with fresh eyes, re-interviewed witnesses, searched for new leads, and slowly, painstakingly, a case began to take shape. When Butler County Prosecutor Michael Gamoser took over the case in 2020, he assigned his investigators to start from the beginning. They would review every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every detail that had been collected over the years, and they would look for what had been missed. Lead investigator Paul Newton began re-interviewing people who had known Caitlyn and John. He traveled to Colorado and Florida, talking to friends who had moved away, people who might have new information or different perspectives after so many years. What emerged was a more complex picture of the relationship between Caitlyn and John. A friend and classmate of Caitlyn's told Newton that after John reported Caitlyn missing, he repeatedly referred to her in the past tense. He spoke about her as if she were already gone, already dead, even before her body had been found. Witnesses described seeing John at a festival the day before Caitlyn disappeared, apparently arguing with her. Some believed they were on the verge of breaking up. This aligned with what investigators had learned about Caitlyn's state of mind in those final days. Her feeling of being trapped, her reconsideration of their planned move to Colorado. Then there was the neighbor, a woman who had lived in the townhouse next to Caitlyn's, their apartment sharing a wall, came forward with a troubling memory. On the night of August 13th, 2011, she had heard an altercation through the wall. She heard a woman's voice shout, "Stop it," followed by a thump. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Young couples argue. But now, in the context of what had happened, the memory took on a chilling significance. Investigators also examined John Carter's behavior in the days immediately after Caitlyn was reported missing. On August 16th, 2011, just 2 days after reporting her missing, Carter drove to Caitlyn's townhouse and removed mail and packages. This was despite being urged to leave everything alone because there was an active police investigation. Why would someone do that? What was he looking for? What was he trying to remove? The digital evidence was equally revealing. Carter had claimed he went home around 1:30 in the morning on August 14th and watched television on his computer before falling asleep around 4. Computer records did show that episodes of his favorite show had played during those hours. But here's what made investigators suspicious. On the morning he reported Caitlyn missing, Carter's internet search history showed that he had been looking up plot summaries and synopses of the episodes he claimed to have watched. Why would someone need to read summaries of shows they had just finished watching? Unless, investigators theorized, he hadn't actually watched them. Unless he was building an alibi, creating a story to explain where he had been and what he had been doing during the critical hours when Caitlyn was killed. Then there was the issue of the text message. Carter claimed he had sent Caitlyn a good morning text around 4 in the morning, before he fell asleep. But phone records showed no such text had ever been sent. It was a small detail, but a significant one. It was a crack in the story. In February of 2023, investigators executed a search warrant at the home of John Carter's mother, the house where John had lived in 2011. It was the same house, less than half a mile from where Caitlyn had lived. A 4-minute walk. John's mother still lived there, and John had used it as his home address as recently as 2021. What they found in that house was deeply disturbing. In an office bedroom, investigators discovered writings, journals, poems. Some had John Carter's name on them. Some did not. They were undated, so it was impossible to know exactly when they had been written. But the content was chilling. One piece of writing read, "Deep down I love her. You want to kill her. But I love her. She must die. I can't kill her. Yes, you can. No. Yes. How do you talk me into all these things? I am just that good." Another read, "I slit your wrist with the key to your heart." There were drawings of an angel in the woods. There were notes about the Caitlyn Markham investigation. And in a shed on the property, investigators found a roll of landscaping material, the same type of black plastic sheeting that Caitlyn's body had been wrapped in when it was found. Prosecutor Jim Moser would later describe these writings as showing the conflict and demon within Carter. They were the words of someone wrestling with violent impulses, someone imagining or remembering an act of murder. On February 17th, 2023, police arrested Jonathan Palmerton, a 35-year-old man who had been Caitlyn's friend. He was charged with perjury for allegedly lying during the investigation. The same day, authorities executed additional search warrants and excavated backyards looking for evidence. But Palmerton wasn't the main target. He was a peripheral figure in a much larger investigation. On March 22, 2023, nearly 12 years after Caitlyn Markham disappeared, nearly 10 years after her remains were discovered, John Carter was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. The indictment against John Carter outlined 2 theories of murder. The first charge alleged that he had purposely caused Caitlyn's death between August 13th and August 14th, 2011. The second charge alleged that he had caused her death as a proximate result of committing felonious assault. Prosecutors believed they knew what had happened, even if they couldn't prove every detail. They believed that on the night of August 13th, an argument had occurred between Caitlyn and John at her townhouse. Perhaps she had told him she wanted to end the relationship. Perhaps she had told him she didn't want to move to Colorado. Whatever sparked it, the argument had escalated. The neighbor had heard Caitlyn shout, "Stop it," through the wall, followed by a thump. Investigators believed this was the moment of the assault. John Carter, faced with the prospect of Caitlyn leaving him, something his friends said would be catastrophic for him, had attacked her. The forensic anthropology report showed trauma to Caitlyn's wrist, consistent with defensive wounds. The writings found in Carter's home mentioned slitting wrists. While the exact cause of death couldn't be determined due to decomposition, prosecutors believed Carter had killed Caitlyn through physical violence and force. Then they believed Carter had wrapped Caitlyn's body in black plastic landscaping material that matched what was found in his mother's shed. He had placed her body in his car, the red Ford that the 2 boys had seen returning to Caitlyn's townhouse around 1:30 in the morning with its lights off. He had driven her body to the remote wooded area near Big Cedar Creek in Indiana, near his father's farm, and dumped her there. After disposing of the body, Carter had constructed an elaborate cover story. He had set up the alibi of watching television, then later searched for episode summaries to make it seem more believable. He had placed Caitlyn's phone in a location where it would ping, trying to create the impression that she had left voluntarily. He had called 911 the next evening, playing the role of the concerned fiancé, and for years he had maintained this performance. He had appeared on television, pleading for Caitlyn's return. He had participated in searches. He had given interviews to investigators, always cooperative on the surface, but deceptive on every polygraph test. He had lived his life, eventually getting married, becoming a father, all while Caitlyn's family suffered without answers. Butler County Sheriff Sergeant Rob Whitlock would later say that investigators had eliminated 20 people of interest through polygraphs or alibis. There was never any doubt, he said, about who was responsible for Caitlyn's disappearance and death. On March 27, 2023, John Carter was arraigned for murder in Butler County Common Pleas Court. He pleaded not guilty through his attorney and was released on a $1 million bond with GPS monitoring. Dave Markham and his younger daughter Allie sat in the front row of the courtroom. Many supporters wore butterflies in remembrance of Caitlyn, who had been known as a free-spirited art student with a love for nature. Carter's trial was scheduled for June 24, 2024. As the trial date approached, both the prosecution and defense knew they faced challenges. For the prosecution, the case was entirely circumstantial. There was no physical evidence directly linking Carter to the murder. There was no DNA, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses to the crime itself. The cause of death couldn't be determined. Any conviction would depend on the jury believing the accumulation of circumstantial evidence was enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For the defense, the challenge was equally daunting. The circumstantial evidence was extensive and damning. The journal writings alone were devastating. The deceptive polygraph results, the inconsistencies in Carter's story, the witness accounts, the location of the body near his family's property, all of it painted a clear picture of guilt. In early June 2024, just weeks before the trial was set to begin, negotiations began between the prosecution and defense. Prosecutor Michael Gmoser was willing to offer a deal. Instead of facing 2 counts of murder, which could result in a lengthy prison sentence if convicted, Carter could plead guilty to a single count of involuntary manslaughter. It was a significant reduction in charges. Involuntary manslaughter is a first-degree misdemeanor in Ohio, carrying a maximum sentence of just 3 years in prison. For a man who had been free for 13 years since Caitlyn's death, who had built a new life, married, had children, 3 years was a far cry from the potential life sentence he faced if convicted of murder. But the deal came with one crucial element. Carter would have to admit his guilt. He would have to acknowledge that he had caused Caitlyn's death. On June 13, 2024, John Carter accepted the plea deal. He pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, admitting that during an assault at Caitlyn's Fairfield townhome in August 2011, he had caused her death through physical violence and force. He did not explain how he killed her. He did not explain why. He simply admitted that he had done it. Thursday, July 18, 2024. The courtroom was packed for John Carter's sentencing hearing. Dave Markham, who had spent 13 years fighting for justice for his daughter, who had given countless interviews and organized countless events to keep Caitlyn's case in the public eye, stood before the court to deliver his victim impact statement. He had written a letter, carefully composed, containing all the pain and anger and grief of those 13 long years. He read it aloud to the court, and to John Carter, who sat silently at the defense table. "Not a day goes by that I don't think of Caitlyn," Dave Markham said. He spoke about the void she had left in their lives, the milestones she would never reach, the art she would never create. He spoke about how often he wondered what she would be doing now if she had lived, how amazing she would have become. "Let him feel the pain that many of us have endured for the past 13 years, Dave Markham said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He implored Judge Daniel Hauke to impose the maximum sentence allowed by law. Carter's defense attorneys asked the judge to consider probation or a minimal prison term. They asked him to consider the law, not emotional statements. They did not dispute that Carter was guilty. They simply asked for leniency. John Carter himself did not speak during the sentencing hearing. He did not offer an explanation for what he had done. He did not apologize to the Markham family. He sat silently while the proceedings unfolded around him. Judge Hauke listened to all the arguments, reviewed all the evidence, considered the plea agreement. Then he delivered his ruling. He sentenced John Carter to the maximum term allowed under the plea deal, 3 years in prison. In his ruling, Judge Hauke noted that Carter had shown no genuine remorse for his offense. He noted that Carter had not tried to help Caitlyn or acknowledge what had happened to her immediately after her death. He had let her family suffer for 13 years, wondering, hoping, grieving. The sentence was handed down, and John Carter was immediately handcuffed and taken into custody. His expected release date from the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction is July 4th, 2027. After the sentencing, Dave Markham spoke to the media. "I do not feel 3 years is justice," he said. Not for Caitlyn, not for her sister, not for me, her friends, or the entire community that has ached and grieved alongside us. But he also expressed a measure of relief. It's not over. And no, it's not closure, he said. But it's the start of something else to come. Prosecutor G. Moser, facing criticism for accepting a plea deal that resulted in such a light sentence, defended his decision. I know that there's a number of people that will condemn me for taking a plea that only allows them to go to prison for 3 years, he said. To me, whether it's 1 day or 6 days or 6 months or 6 years or 60 years, it was more important to me to get justice by an admission of guilt for Caitlyn Markham. The admission of guilt mattered. For 13 years, John Carter had maintained his innocence. He had portrayed himself as a grieving fiancé, a man desperately seeking his lost love. The plea deal, for all its limitations, stripped away that pretense. John Carter had admitted to the world that he had killed Caitlyn Markham. Today, Caitlyn Markham is remembered not as a victim, but as the vibrant, creative, spirited young woman she was. Her friends and family continue to honor her memory through her art. The butterflies that supporters wore at court proceedings became a symbol of Caitlyn's free spirit, her love of nature, her artistic soul. She was a woman who saw the world through an artist's eyes, who always had a paintbrush tucked in her hair, who was just weeks away from achieving her dream of graduating with a degree in graphic arts. She had her whole life ahead of her, plans and possibilities stretching out into a future she would never see. Her father, Dave Markham, has said that he often wonders what she would be doing with her art and her career. He thinks she would have been an amazing woman. Past tense now, because John Carter made sure that future could never happen. The case of Caitlyn Markham is a reminder of how long the path to justice can be. Nearly 2 years passed before her body was found. Nearly 12 years passed before anyone was arrested. 13 years passed before her killer admitted what he had done. It's a reminder that behind every true crime case is a real person, with real dreams and real loved ones. Caitlyn wasn't just a case file or a news headline. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, an artist. She was loved, and she is missed. And while 3 years may seem like too little time for a man who took so much, the truth is now known. The pretense has been stripped away. John Carter will carry the weight of that admission for the rest of his life. And the Markham family has at least the cold comfort of knowing that the world knows what happened to Caitlyn. As we come to the end of this story, I want you to take a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Let it out even more slowly. The story of Caitlyn Markham is difficult, filled with loss and injustice and the long, painful wait for truth. But it's also a story about a father who never gave up on his daughter. It's about a community that came together to search for one of their own. It's about investigators who refused to let the case go cold, who kept working year after year until they found the truth. Remember Caitlyn, not for how her life ended, but for how she lived. Creative, thoughtful, sweet, outgoing. An artist with a paintbrush, always ready, always looking for the next project, the next inspiration. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. The Murder of Holly Bobo. Tonight, we'll explore a story from the small town of Parsons, Tennessee. A story of a young woman whose bright future was stolen one spring morning, and the long, winding path toward truth that followed. This is the story of Holly Bobo. Take a deep breath. Let the tension leave your shoulders. As we journey through this narrative together, allow the gentle cadence of these words to carry you toward rest, even as we explore the shadows of this haunting case. In the rolling hills of West Tennessee, where the landscape stretches out in patches of farmland and dense woods, there lies the community of Darden. It's the kind of place where neighbors know each other by name, where church on Sunday brings the community together, and where families build their lives slowly, deliberately, with their own hands. This was the world Holly Lynn Bobo was born into on October 12th, 1990. Her parents, Karen and Dana Bobo, had literally built their home themselves. Board by board, nail by nail, they created the place where they would raise their family. It sat on a quiet road called Swan Johnson Road, surrounded by woods and the kind of peaceful countryside that makes you believe the worst troubles of the world couldn't possibly reach you there. Holly grew up alongside her older brother Clint, who was born 5 years before her in 1985. The Bobo children spent their days the way children in rural Tennessee do, riding horses through the fields, fishing in nearby creeks, exploring the woods on ATVs, their laughter echoing through the trees. They were a close family, active in their local church, the Corinth Baptist Church, where Holly would often sing gospel songs, her voice rising clear and pure above the congregation. Karen Bobo was an elementary school teacher, beloved by her students and respected in the community. She and Holly shared a bond that went beyond the typical mother-daughter relationship. Friends would say they could finish each other's sentences, that they moved through the world in a kind of synchronicity that only the luckiest families experience. Holly was in every sense her mother's daughter. As Holly grew older, her gentle nature and strong moral compass became evident to everyone who knew her. In high school at Scotts Hill High, she maintained one of the highest grade point averages in her graduating class. But it wasn't just her academic success that people remembered. Holly was the kind of student who wouldn't even let her friends copy her homework because she believed it was wrong. She had principles, and she lived by them, even when it would have been easier not to. Friends described her as someone who inspired others to be themselves, to be bold, to stand up for what they believed in. She had blonde hair that fell to her shoulders, bright blue eyes, and a smile that seemed to light up whatever room she entered. She stood 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed approximately 110 pounds, petite but full of life and determination. By the spring of 2011, Holly was 20 years old and pursuing her dream of becoming a nurse. She was enrolled at the University of Tennessee at Martin Parsons Center, studying diligently, working toward a future where she could help people, ease suffering, make a difference. She had a boyfriend named Drew Scott, and their relationship seemed solid, filled with the kind of simple happiness that young love brings. Everything about Holly's life suggested a bright future stretching out before her. She was on the cusp of everything, her whole life waiting to unfold. And then came April 13th, 2011. The morning began like any other in the Bobo household, quiet and routine. Holly woke early, at 4:30 in the morning, while darkness still blanketed the Tennessee countryside. She had an exam coming up in her nursing program, and she wanted to study before her class. This was typical Holly, dedicated and thorough, never one to leave things to chance. The house was still as she reviewed her notes, the only sounds the occasional creak of the old home settling, the distant call of birds beginning their dawn chorus. By 7:30, as soft morning light began filtering through the windows, Holly received a call from her boyfriend, Drew. He was nearby, hunting turkeys on his grandmother's property, something he and Clint had discussed the night before. It was turkey hunting season, and many men in the area would be out in the woods that morning, dressed in camouflage, moving silently through the trees. Holly's mother, Karen, had already left for work at the school. Her father, Dana, had departed even earlier. Her brother Clint, then 25 years old and working toward his own degree in social work, was still asleep in the house. Around 8 o'clock, something shattered the peaceful morning. A neighbor heard a scream coming from the direction of the Bobo home. It was the kind of scream that stops you cold, that sends chills down your spine, the kind that makes you know instinctively that something is terribly wrong. The neighbor immediately called his mother, who in turn contacted Karen Bobo at her workplace. "I heard screaming from your house," she told her. Karen's heart must have seized in her chest. She had left her children safe at home less than half an hour before. What could possibly be wrong? Karen called the house. Clint answered the phone, groggy from sleep. Clint told his mother that he had been awakened by the sound of the family's dogs barking. He had heard what he thought might be a mild argument outside. When he looked out the window, he saw something that in the moment didn't alarm him. He saw Holly walking toward the woods behind their house. She was with a man dressed entirely in camouflage, head to toe. The man wore a cap, and dark hair stuck out from beneath it, long enough to touch his collar. From behind, from the distance and angle where Clint stood at the window, he assumed this was Drew, Holly's boyfriend. After all, Drew had told them just the night before that he would be turkey hunting that morning. Of course he would be wearing camouflage. Holly's car was still in the driveway, Clint told his mother. She should have already left for school. That's when Karen knew. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. She instructed Clint to call 911, then hung up and did the same herself. Clint went to investigate further. He stepped outside, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Blood. There was blood in the carport. Not a large amount, but enough. enough to know that something violent had occurred. He called out for Holly. Silence answered him, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant sounds of the woods. Holly was gone. Law enforcement descended on the Bobo home with swift urgency. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the TBI, took the lead. The FBI joined them. Local sheriffs, deputies, marshals, they all came, transforming the quiet country road into a hub of frantic activity. Immediately, investigators began combing through the details of what had happened. Clint described the man he had seen with Holly. Between 5 feet 10 inches and 6 feet tall, he estimated, weighing somewhere between 180 and 200 pounds. The camouflage pattern was either mossy oak breakup or leafy wear, the kind of hunting gear sold in sporting goods stores across the South. The man had worn a cap, and beneath it, dark hair that was long enough to touch the collar of his jacket. The voice Clint had heard from outside during what he thought might be an argument had been very deep and low, but Clint had never seen the man's face. He had only seen him from behind, walking away with Holly toward the tree line. Early reports would claim that Holly had been dragged from the house, but this was quickly corrected. According to Clint, Holly had walked with the man. Whether she went willingly out of fear or because the man had threatened her or someone she loved, no one could say. But she had walked. Within hours, the first volunteers began arriving. Friends, neighbors, strangers who had heard the news. They came by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Within days, thousands of people were searching the woods and fields around Parsons, calling Holly's name, hoping against hope to find her alive. Pink ribbons began appearing everywhere. On trees, on fence posts, on storefronts in Parsons. Pictures of Holly smiled from every surface. The reward for information grew rapidly. First $25,000 from the community. Then Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam added $50,000 more. Eventually the reward would reach $85,000. The search was massive, one of the largest manhunts in Tennessee history. They searched along roads through dense forests across farmland. They dragged ponds and streams. They used helicopters, search dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and they found things. Holly's lunchbox, discovered along a roadside. Her cell phone and its SIM card, which had been removed, found separately. The SIM card's last ping came from a specific area, giving investigators a possible direction. Her homework and school papers, scattered. A receipt with her name on it. Even pieces of her clothing. Each discovery was like a breadcrumb, a clue that might lead them to her. But Holly herself remained missing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The investigation was painstaking. The TBI set up a command center in Parsons that remained staffed day and night. Tips poured in, hundreds of them, and each one had to be investigated, tracked down, ruled out, or followed up. Suspicion inevitably turned toward those closest to Holly. Clint Bobo found himself under intense scrutiny. He was the last person to see her. His story about what he had witnessed seemed to shift slightly as he tried to remember more details, which investigators viewed with suspicion. They asked him to take a polygraph test. He took it. They asked him to take another. He took that one too. They searched his phone, his computer, checked his clothing for evidence of a struggle. Clint was cleared, but the experience left scars. He would later describe the agony of knowing that while investigators were looking at him, the real perpetrator was getting farther away, covering tracks, disappearing into the fabric of everyday life. The family was devastated. Karen Bobo would later say that Sundays were the hardest because that was when the family had always been together, all day, doing things as a unit. Now there was an empty space where Holly should have been, a silence that filled every room. But they never gave up hope. Not then. They held vigils. They prayed. They kept searching. Early in the investigation, the TBI focused heavily on a man named Terry Britt. Britt was a registered sex offender who lived not far from the Bobo home. He had a long criminal history, multiple convictions for rape and kidnapping. His pattern of victims was chilling. He targeted blonde women with blue eyes, women who looked like Holly. The lead investigator, TBI agent Terry Dykes, became convinced that Britt was responsible. Britt's alibi for the morning of April 13th didn't check out. His physical description matched what Clint had provided. When Clint later heard a voice sample from Britt, he said it sounded similar to the deep, low voice he had heard that morning. Investigators wiretapped Britt's phone. They searched his house, his vehicles, his property, looking for any evidence that might connect him to Holly's disappearance. They interviewed him multiple times, but they found nothing concrete. No physical evidence. No proof. And in the background there were other names that kept surfacing. names that would later become central to the entire case. Zachary Adams, his brother John Dylan Adams, their associates Jason Autry and Shane Austin, and two other men, Jeffrey and Mark Piercy. Early in the investigation, these men were looked at briefly. Karen Bobo, as an elementary school teacher, had taught both Zachary Adams and Jason Autry when they were children. She knew them, recognized their names when investigators mentioned them, but at the time there seemed to be no evidence linking them to Holly's disappearance. They had alibis. Their physical descriptions didn't perfectly match what Clint had described, so the investigation moved on. Time passed. The case grew cold. For 3 years, the Bobo family lived in agonizing uncertainty. Was Holly still alive somewhere? Had she been taken far away? Was she being held captive? Or had the worst already happened, and they simply didn't know it yet? The not knowing was its own special kind of torture. September 7th, 2014. Two men were out in the woods of northern Decatur County, hunting for ginseng, a valuable root that grows wild in those Tennessee forests. They were walking through an area near a place that locals called Kelly Ridge, miles from the Bobo home, when they saw something that made them stop. A bucket, white plastic, sitting among the leaves and undergrowth. When they approached it, what they found inside would change everything. Human remains. A skull, bones. The men immediately contacted authorities. Within hours, the scene was swarmed with investigators. The remains were carefully documented, photographed, collected. They were taken to the medical examiner's office for testing. Among the remains, investigators found Holly Bobo's driver's license. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. The bones belonged to Holly. After 3 years and 5 months of searching, of hoping, of praying for a miracle, the terrible truth was finally known. Holly Bobo was dead. She had been murdered. The medical examiner determined that she had died from a gunshot wound to the back of the head. Based on the evidence, it appeared she had died on or very near April 13th, 2011, the day she disappeared. The discovery of Holly's remains reignited the investigation with fierce intensity. But here's where the case takes its most complex and controversial turn. In March of 2014, just months before Holly's remains were found, a man named John Dylan Adams, brother to Zachary Adams, had been arrested on federal weapons charges. Dylan Adams was known to have an intellectual disability. He had attended special schools for children with learning disabilities his entire life. He wore a digital watch because he had trouble telling time. His IQ was low, and those who knew him described him as easily influenced, vulnerable. While Dylan was in custody on the weapons charge, which could have resulted in a lengthy prison sentence, something unusual happened. The prosecutor handling his case, who was also involved in the Bobo investigation, arranged a plea deal. Dylan would avoid prison time, but with a condition. He would go live with a retired police officer named Dennis Benjamin, someone Dylan had never met before. 5 weeks later, Dennis Benjamin called 911. He said he had someone in his home who wanted to confess to the murder of Holly Bobo. Dylan Adams told investigators a story. He said that on April 13th, 2011, he had gone to his brother Zachary's house to get his truck. When he arrived, he saw something shocking. Holly Bobo, sitting in a green chair in the living room, wearing a pink t-shirt. Jason Autry was standing nearby. Zachary was wearing camouflage shorts, a black sleeveless t-shirt, and green Crocs. According to Dylan's statement, Zachary told him that he had raped Holly and had videotaped it. This confession, obtained under circumstances that would later be heavily scrutinized and criticized, became the foundation for a series of arrests. On March 5, 2014, Zachary Adams was indicted on charges of especially aggravated kidnapping and first-degree felony murder. Jason Autry was indicted on similar charges on April 29th. Dylan Adams himself was charged with rape, kidnapping, and murder. Shane Austin was initially given an immunity deal in exchange for leading investigators to Holly's body. When he failed to take them to the correct location, the deal was revoked. Before he could be formally charged, Austin was found dead in a hotel room in Bartow, Florida, in February 2015. His death was ruled a suicide. Two other men, Jeffrey and Mark Piercy, were arrested on charges of tampering with evidence and accessory after the fact. These charges would eventually be dropped. 6 men in total had been implicated in varying degrees in Holly's murder, but only 3 would ever be prosecuted: Zachary Adams, Dylan Adams, and Jason Autry. The trial of Zachary Adams began on September 11, 2017, more than 6 years after Holly's disappearance. The courtroom in Savannah, Tennessee was packed. The case had captured national attention. The Bobo family sat in the front row day after day, listening to testimony that would rip open old wounds. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the testimony of Jason Autry, who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Autry took the stand and described in chilling detail what he claimed happened on April 13th. According to Autry's testimony, Zachary Adams had called him that morning and asked for help with something, but wouldn't say what. When Autry arrived at Adams's house, he saw a body wrapped in a blanket in the bed of Adams's truck. Adams told him it was Holly Bobo. Autry testified that he asked Adams how this had happened. According to Autry, Adams said that he, along with Shane Austin and Dylan Adams, had gone to the Bobo home to teach Clint how to cook methamphetamine. Holly had come out of the house screaming and hollering, and they took her. Autry said he agreed to help dispose of the body. They drove to an underpass near Interstate 40 along the Tennessee River. The plan, Autry claimed, was to gut Holly's body so it wouldn't float, then drop it in the deep part of the river where turtles would consume the remains. But when they unloaded the body from the truck bed, something horrifying happened. Holly moved. She made a sound. She was still alive. Autry testified that he immediately called out to Adams, saying that she was alive. Fearful that Holly had heard his name and would identify him, Autry said he told Adams that something needed to be done. Autry ran up the trail to serve as a lookout, while Adams retrieved a gun from his truck and fired a shot. The sound echoed under the bridge. Birds scattered, then silence. According to Autry, they loaded Holly's body back into the truck, and Adams later told him that he had dumped it near Kelly Ridge. The prosecution presented other evidence as well. Witnesses testified that Zachary Adams had made statements implicating himself in Holly's disappearance. His ex-girlfriend Rebecca Earp testified that Adams had threatened her, saying he would tie her up just like he did Holly Bobo, and nobody would ever see her again. Adams had allegedly threatened his brother Dylan after Dylan's arrest, telling him he would put him in a hole beside her if he didn't keep his mouth shut. A white truck had been seen leaving the Bobo property rapidly on the morning of the abduction. Zachary Adams drove a white truck. A receipt and other papers belonging to Holly had been found near Shane Austin's home, 75 feet from his driveway. But there was a problem, a significant problem. There was no physical evidence connecting Zachary Adams to the crime. No DNA, no fingerprints, no forensic proof. A gun was introduced into evidence, an Arminius model HW.532 caliber Smith & Wesson long revolver. A local man claimed that Austin and Autry had sold it to him in exchange for drugs, and that it had been found in a body of water. But forensic tests on the weapon found no DNA or fingerprints, and prosecutors couldn't link it to the case with ballistics tests. The defense argued that Zachary Adams was 100% innocent. They pointed out that cell phone pings didn't follow the path that Holly's phone had taken. None of the accused men perfectly matched the description that Clint Bobo had given. Zachary Adams was too tall. Dylan Adams was too tall and too thin. Shane Austin had the right height and weight, but he had short red hair, not dark hair that covered his neck. The defense called former TBI agent Terry Dykes, the original lead investigator, to testify. Dykes told the jury that he had ruled these men out early in the case because their alibis checked out. Their cell phone records put them miles away from the crime scene, and Shane Austin had even passed a polygraph test. The defense argued that Autry had concocted his entire story in exchange for a reduced sentence. They noted that Autry had access to all the details of the case through discovery, through evidence that had been shared with defense attorneys. He could have pieced together a narrative that seemed to fit, using real information that was already known. They pointed to the initial suspect, Terry Britt, as the more likely perpetrator. Britt matched Clint's description. His voice sounded similar. His alibi was fabricated. A palm print found at the scene didn't exclude him, but the prosecution argued that witnesses who knew Zachary Adams, including jail inmates, had heard him make admissions about hurting Holly. That the threats he made to his girlfriend and his brother showed consciousness of guilt. That the circumstantial evidence, when taken together, pointed to Adams's involvement. The trial lasted 11 days. Emotions ran high throughout. At one point, Karen Bobo collapsed on the witness stand, overcome with grief as she testified about her daughter. On September 22, 2017, after several hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty, on all counts, especially aggravated kidnapping, first-degree felony murder, aggravated rape. Zachary Adams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years for the kidnapping and rape convictions. In September 2018, Dylan Adams pleaded guilty to facilitation of first-degree murder and especially aggravated kidnapping as part of a plea deal. He received a 35-year prison sentence. His attorneys had argued that his confession was coerced, that his intellectual disability made him vulnerable to manipulation. The videotape of his interrogation showed detectives doing most of the talking, leading him through the narrative. Jason Autry pleaded guilty to solicitation to commit murder and facilitation of especially aggravated kidnapping. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and was released in 2020. 2 months after his release, he was arrested on federal weapons violations after a deputy saw him in a rural field with a rifle. For the Bobo family, the verdicts brought a measure of closure. Karen Bobo said there was no doubt in her mind that authorities had the right people in custody. She wore the promise ring that Drew had given Holly, the ring that had been found in the woods, keeping her daughter close. But the case was far from over. In January 2024, 7 years after Zachary Adams' conviction, a stunning development emerged. Jason Autry, the star witness whose testimony had been praised by the trial judge as highly credible, had recanted. He admitted that he had made the entire story up. According to a petition filed by Adams' appellate lawyer, Autry had met with a forensic neuropsychologist named Dr. Katie Spirko in December of the previous year. During their discussions, Autry told her that his testimony at trial had been completely fabricated. Autry claimed that before the trial, his own attorney had told him that he was 95% certain to be convicted on the charges against him. Facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, Autry said he concocted the story in his jail cell while reviewing discovery evidence. He had access to extensive cell phone data, to maps, to reports, to all the information that had been gathered over years of investigation. He took his actual whereabouts on April 13th, and, in his words, added Holly to it. The entire narrative about helping dispose of her body, about her being alive and making a sound, about the gunshot under the bridge. All of it was fiction, he now claimed. Autry said the details of his story, like the gun, came from information about other suspects that was in the discovery materials. He recreated it all, he said, in 3 days. This revelation sent shockwaves through the legal community and left the Bobo family reeling once again. The question became unavoidable. If Autry's testimony was false, and if there was no physical evidence connecting Zachary Adams to the crime, was an innocent man sitting in prison for a murder he didn't commit? Or was this recantation itself a lie? Perhaps guilt catching up with Autry? Perhaps an attempt to somehow undo what he had done? The prosecution argued that Adams would have been convicted even without Autry's testimony. Other witnesses had testified about Adams making incriminating admissions. The circumstantial evidence, they maintained, was sufficient. But courts view recanted testimony with deep suspicion. It creates doubt, reasonable doubt, the kind that can unravel convictions. In June 2024, the case returned to court, the same courtroom where the trial had taken place. Karen and Dana Bobo sat in the gallery once again, having to relive their nightmare as lawyers argued over whether Zachary Adams deserved a new trial. The judge, Circuit Court Judge J. Brent Bradbury, took the matter under advisement. As of now, he has not yet ruled on whether to grant an evidentiary hearing or dismiss the petition. Zachary Adams remains in prison. Jason Autry awaits sentencing on his federal weapons charges. Dylan Adams serves his 35-year sentence. And the truth? The actual truth of what happened to Holly Bobo on that April morning? It remains elusive, shrouded in contradictions and competing narratives. Even now, more than a decade after Holly disappeared, fundamental questions remain unanswered. If Zachary Adams and the others were involved, how did they know Holly would be home that morning? How did they know the layout of the property, the timing, the fact that she would be alone? The prosecution's theory that they had come to teach Clint to make methamphetamine was never proven, and Clint vehemently denied it. If Terry Britt was responsible, as the original lead investigator believed, why was no physical evidence ever found linking him to the crime? Why couldn't investigators build a case against him despite years of effort? Why was Dylan Adams, a man with intellectual disabilities, targeted for questioning about Holly's disappearance in the first place? What led investigators to him? This has never been clearly explained. The alleged videotape that Zachary supposedly made of himself raping Holly was never found. Did it ever exist? Or was this another fabricated detail? How did Holly's body end up where it was found? If Autry's testimony about the location was false, did Adams move it after the fact? Was someone else involved who was never identified or charged? What about the other men who were implicated but never prosecuted? Jeffrey and Mark Piercy had been arrested for tampering with evidence and accessory after the fact. Those charges were dropped. What did they know? What role, if any, did they play? And perhaps most troubling of all, if Jason Autry's recantation is true, if he fabricated his testimony to save himself from prison, what does that mean for justice? Not just for Zachary Adams, but for Holly? For her family? The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation called this the most exhaustive and expensive investigation in their history. Thousands of man-hours, tens of thousands of tips investigated, a massive search effort, and yet so much remains uncertain. In the small town of Parsons, Tennessee, Holly Bobo's memory lives on. Pink ribbons still appear each year around the anniversary of her disappearance. Her family continues to honor her, to speak her name, to ensure she is not forgotten. The case exposed the dark underbelly of drug abuse in rural West Tennessee, a world that most residents of these quiet communities didn't know existed in their midst. Witness testimony during the trial painted a disturbing picture of methamphetamine use, of lives destroyed by addiction, of people capable of unspeakable acts. It also revealed the limitations of the justice system. How do you convict someone when there is no physical evidence? How much weight do you give to witness testimony when those witnesses have their own motivations for talking? How do you balance the need for closure with the possibility that the truth is more complicated than any single narrative can capture? For Karen and Dana Bobo, for Clint, the pain never fully goes away. Karen has said that a part of them is still missing, will always be missing. The world, she said, missed out on one of the sweetest souls she has ever known. Holly wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to help people, to ease suffering, to make the world a little bit better. That dream was stolen from her when she was just 20 years old, when her whole life should have been stretching out before her like an open road. Instead, she became a symbol of innocence lost, of a family's unending grief, of a community's collective trauma, of a case that captured the nation's attention and held it for years, and of the questions that linger when justice feels incomplete. As you drift towards sleep, let yourself release the weight of this story. Let it settle somewhere in the back of your mind. A reminder that the world contains both great beauty and profound darkness. That truth can be elusive, that certainty is sometimes a luxury we cannot afford. Think of Holly on those childhood days, riding horses through Tennessee fields, singing in church, laughing with her mother, her whole future bright and full of possibility. Let that be the image that stays with you. Not the darkness that came later, but the light she brought to the world while she was in it. The case of Holly Bobo reminds us that some stories don't have neat endings. That sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite years of investigation and searching and hoping, we are left with more questions than answers. That justice, when it comes, may not feel like enough. That truth can be layered, complex, contradictory. But it also reminds us of the strength of families who refuse to give up, of communities that come together in times of crisis, of investigators who dedicate years of their lives to seeking answers, of the importance of remembering, of saying the names of those we've lost, of honoring their memory. Rest now. Let the story fade as sleep approaches. Tomorrow will bring new light, new questions, new possibilities. But for now, just rest. Holly's story, like all stories, becomes part of the larger tapestry of human experience. We carry these tales with us, these reminders of fragility and resilience, of darkness and light, of loss and love. And in the carrying, in the remembering, something of those we've lost remains alive. Sleep well, let peace find you in the quiet hours. And may Holly Bobo's memory be a blessing, both to those who knew her and to those who have only heard her story. Good night.